Victoria Sullivan Hayes ripped the newborn from Margaret's arms with hands that trembled not from guilt but from greed. "Give her back!" Margaret screamed. Her body still bleeding from childbirth, her wrist strapped to the hospital bed. "That's my daughter Victoria, please." Victoria didn't look back. She handed the crying infant to the nurse and signed the adoption papers on the same table where Margaret's commitment documents already lay drying. In 4 minutes, she had stolen a mother's child and a widow's fortune. 30 years later, Margaret Sullivan would escape from that psychiatric prison with nothing but $127 and a promise she would find her daughter, reclaim her home, and expose every person who had buried her alive. If you're joining me on this journey, please subscribe to my channel and follow Margaret's story to the very end. Comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far her story travels. The phone call that destroyed Margaret Sullivan's life came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in January 1994. She was 7 months pregnant, sleeping alone in the master bedroom of the Sullivan mansion because Daniel had been in New York for an auction. The phone on the nightstand rang 3 times before she could reach it, her swollen belly making every movement an effort. "Mrs. Sullivan." The voice was male official, practiced in delivering devastation. "This is Officer Rodriguez from the Connecticut State Police. There's been an accident." Margaret's hand found her stomach instinctively as if she could protect the baby from whatever was coming. "What kind of accident?" "Your husband's vehicle was struck by a tractor trailer on Interstate 95 approximately 2 hours ago. I'm sorry, ma'am. He didn't survive." The phone slipped from her fingers. She heard herself screaming, but it sounded like someone else, someone very far away. Daniel was dead. Daniel, who had kissed her goodbye just yesterday morning, who had promised to bring back her favorite chocolates from that shop in Greenwich Village, who had placed his hand on her belly and whispered to their daughter that Daddy would be home soon. Daniel was dead and Margaret was alone. The funeral was held 5 days later. Margaret stood at the graveside in a black dress that barely fit over her pregnancy, accepting condolences from people whose faces blurred together. Daniel's brother Thomas stood beside her, his hand on her elbow, playing the role of supportive family. "Lean on me, Maggie," Thomas said, his voice thick with performed grief. That's what family is for. She had trusted him. God help her, she had trusted him completely. Thomas Sullivan was 3 years younger than Daniel and half as successful. Where Daniel had built a reputation as one of the most respected art dealers on the East Coast, Thomas had bounced from failed business to failed business, always needing loans, always promising that the next venture would be the one that finally paid off. Daniel had never said no to his brother. That was Daniel's weakness. He loved too easily, trusted too completely. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Margaret said that night, sitting in the living room of the mansion that suddenly felt enormous and empty. "The baby is coming in 2 months. Daniel handled everything, the business, the finances, all of it." Thomas exchanged a glance with his wife Victoria that Margaret didn't catch. "That's exactly what we wanted to talk to you about." Victoria Sullivan was the kind of woman who smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. She had married Thomas 15 years ago, and in all that time, Margaret had never felt warmth from her only calculation. Victoria worked as an assistant at a prestigious Manhattan gallery, learning the art world from the inside building connections that Thomas insisted would eventually make them rich. "You've been under tremendous stress," Victoria said, settling onto the couch beside Margaret with practiced sympathy. "The pregnancy, the shock of Daniel's death, it's too much for anyone to handle alone. I'll manage. I have to for the baby." "Of course you will, but we've been worried about you, Maggie. Thomas has noticed things." Margaret turned to look at her brother-in-law. "What things?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "The other day when I came by to drop off the mail, you didn't remember our conversation from that morning. You seemed confused about what day it was." "I'd just woken up from a nap. I was disoriented." "And last week," Victoria continued, "you called me asking about documents that Daniel had already told you were with his lawyer. You'd forgotten the entire conversation." Such. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January weather. "That's not true. I never—" "It's the grief," Thomas said quickly. "Combined with the pregnancy hormones. It's affecting your memory, your judgment. We think you should see someone just to talk to make sure you're processing everything in a healthy way." "I don't need to see anyone. I'm fine." Victoria's hand closed over Margaret's, and the touch felt like a trap snapping shut. "We've already made an appointment. Dr. Raymond Kessler. He's a friend of Thomas's, very respected in his field. Tomorrow morning at 10. I'm not going. Maggie." Thomas's voice hardened slightly. "Daniel would want you to take care of yourself, for the baby's sake, if nothing else." Daniel's name wielded like a weapon. Margaret felt the fight drain out of her. Maybe they were right. Maybe grief was affecting her more than she realized. "What harm could one appointment do? Fine," she said. "One appointment." Thomas smiled, and for just a moment Margaret thought she saw something triumphant in his eyes. But she was tired, so tired, and she told herself she was imagining things. She wasn't. Dr. Raymond Kessler's office was located in a medical building on the outskirts of Hartford, a bland structure that Margaret would later learn was strategically chosen, close enough to Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital for convenient transfers far enough from the city to avoid attention. Kessler himself was a thin man in his early 60s with rimless glasses and the kind of professionally neutral expression that revealed nothing. He shook Margaret's hand with fingers that were cold and dry, and he gestured to a chair across from his desk without warmth. "Please sit. Your brother-in-law has told me a great deal about your situation." Margaret lowered herself into the chair, one hand on her belly. "I'm not sure what he told you, but I'm fine. I lost my husband 3 weeks ago. I'm pregnant. I'm allowed to be sad." "Of course you are." Kessler made a note on his pad. "But sadness and confusion are different things. Thomas mentioned episodes of memory loss, disorientation, difficulty distinguishing between conversations that happened and conversations you imagined. That's not, I never said any of that. He also mentioned paranoid ideation, a belief that people are plotting against you." Margaret's heart began to pound. "I don't have any such beliefs. Dr. Kessler, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I came here as a courtesy to my family, but I don't need psychiatric evaluation. I'm a grieving widow, that's all." Kessler looked up from his notes. His eyes behind those rimless glasses were completely empty of compassion. "Mrs. Sullivan, denial of symptoms is itself a symptom. Your resistance to help is concerning." "My resistance to help? I've been here for 5 minutes." "Elevated agitation, defensive posture, pressured speech." He wrote each observation down as he spoke. These are all consistent with the picture Thomas painted. Margaret stood her legs unsteady beneath her. "I'm leaving. This was a mistake. Mrs. Sullivan, I strongly advise against—" "I don't care what you advise. I'm leaving." She turned toward the door and found Thomas standing there blocking her exit. Victoria was beside him, and between them stood 2 men in white uniforms that Margaret recognized with dawning horror. Hospital orderlies. "I'm sorry, Maggie," Thomas said. He didn't look sorry. He looked like a man who had finally gotten what he wanted. "But you're not well. Dr. Kessler has agreed that you need inpatient treatment." "You can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not crazy." "The commitment papers are already signed," Victoria said calmly. "As your next of kin, Thomas has the authority to make medical decisions on your behalf during your incapacitation." "I'm not incapacitated, dear doctor. Kessler's evaluation says otherwise." Victoria stepped forward and her voice dropped to a whisper that only Margaret could hear. "Stop fighting. You're making this harder than it needs to be. The house, the accounts, Daniel's collection, Thomas and I will take care of everything while you recover. You should be grateful." Margaret felt the orderly's hands close around her arms. She felt herself being pulled toward the door, toward a van waiting in the parking lot, toward a nightmare that would last 30 years. "You can't do this," she screamed. "I'm pregnant. My baby will be well cared for," Kessler said, making a final note. "I've arranged for you to deliver at Pinecrest. The child will be placed with a suitable family afterward." No, you can't take my baby." But they could, and they did. Margaret Sullivan was admitted to Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital on January 27, 1994. She was 38 years old, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone in the world. The first weeks were a blur of medication and despair. They gave her pills that turned her thoughts to cotton, that made her sleep 18 hours a day, that erased the sharp edges of her grief and replaced them with a fog so thick she sometimes forgot her own name. But she never forgot Daniel, and she never forgot what Thomas and Victoria had done. Between the doses and the brief windows of clarity that the medication allowed, Margaret tried to understand what had happened. Why would Thomas and Victoria go to such lengths to have her committed? What did they gain? The answer came to her in fragments, memories surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. Daniel had been secretive about certain aspects of his business. There were phone calls he took in his study with the door closed, trips to Europe that he never fully explained, a safe in the basement that he had forbidden her from opening. She had trusted him, had assumed these were simply the private concerns of his work, not matters for a wife to worry about. But she remembered now a conversation from 6 months before his death. "If anything ever happens to me," Daniel had said, holding her close in their bed, "there are things in this house that people would kill to find. Important things. Valuable things. Promise me you'll protect them, Maggie. Promise me you won't let anyone take what's ours." "Daniel, you're scaring me. What are you talking about?" "The house knows," he had whispered. "The house remembers everything. When the time comes, you'll understand." She hadn't understood then. But lying in her narrow bed at Pinecrest, counting the days until her baby would be born, Margaret began to piece together the truth. Daniel had hidden something in the house. Something valuable enough that Thomas and Victoria were willing to imprison his widow to find it. If you're wondering how Margaret survived what was coming, stay with me, because what happens next tested every ounce of strength she had left. The baby came on March 15, 1994. Margaret had been moved to a delivery room within Pinecrest attended by nurses who spoke to each other over her head as if she wasn't there. The labor lasted 14 hours, and through every contraction, every wave of agony, Margaret held on to one thought: she would see her daughter's face. Whatever else they took from her, they couldn't take that moment. The baby emerged screaming, red-faced and furious at the indignity of birth, and the doctor placed her on Margaret's chest for what he called skin-to-skin bonding. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, Daniel's dark hair already visible in a wild tuft on her tiny head. She had her father's nose and her mother's eyes, and when those eyes opened for the first time, Margaret felt something inside her shatter and reform into something new. "Hello, baby girl," she whispered. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby's hand closed around Margaret's finger, a grip stronger than anything so small should be able to manage. Mother and daughter looked at each other, and for just a moment, the psychiatric hospital and the betrayal and the nightmare of the past weeks all disappeared. "I'm going to name you Sophie," Margaret said. "After your grandmother, my mother. She was the strongest woman I ever knew, and you're going to be strong too. You're going to be a survivor." Sophie made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the random noise of a newborn, but Margaret chose to believe it was the former. "I need you to listen to me, Sophie. Mama's in trouble right now. Bad people are doing bad things, and Mama can't stop them yet. But I promise you, I promise on everything I am, I will find you. No matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to do, I will find you." The door opened. Victoria walked in, followed by a nurse and a woman Margaret had never seen before, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the hungry look of someone who had been waiting for something precious. "Time's up," Victoria said. "What? No, I need more time. Please." "The adoptive mother is here." Victoria gestured to the stranger. "Say goodbye, Maggie." The nurse moved toward the bed, reaching for Sophie. Margaret's arms tightened instinctively, pulling her daughter closer. "Don't touch her. She's mine. You can't—" "The papers are signed." Victoria's voice was ice. "Thomas has legal authority over your affairs, including the placement of your child. The adoption is already finalized." "No, no, please. Victoria, please don't do this. I'll sign whatever you want. The house, the money, all of it. Just let me keep my baby." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across Victoria's face. It might have been doubt or guilt or simply the inconvenience of a scene. Then her expression hardened. "Dr. Kessler has determined that you're unfit to raise a child. This is for her own good." "Her own good? You're stealing her? This is kidnapping." The nurse pried Sophie from Margaret's arms. Margaret screamed, lunged forward toward felt hands pushing her back against the bed. She heard Sophie crying, heard her own voice begging, pleading, making promises she had no power to keep. Victoria stood at the door, watching with those cold, calculating eyes. "You should have just signed the power of attorney when we asked Maggie. This didn't have to be so difficult." "I'll kill you," Margaret snarled. "I swear to God, Victoria, I'll kill you for this." Victoria smiled. "And statements like that are exactly why you're in here." She turned to the nurse. "Note the patient's violent threats in her chart. Recommend increased sedation and extended isolation." Then she was gone. Sophie was gone, and Margaret was alone with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. She didn't remember much of the following weeks. They drugged her heavily, kept her confined to her room, and when she woke screaming, which was often, they drugged her more. She lost track of days of weeks of time itself, but slowly, inevitably, her mind began to clear. Not because the drugs stopped working, but because Margaret Sullivan made a decision that changed everything. She decided to survive. The realization came to her on a morning in late April when the fog of medication lifted just enough for her to recognize the trap she was in. If she kept fighting openly, they would keep drugging her. If they kept drugging her, she would lose her mind for real, become the crazy woman they claimed she already was. But if she pretended to accept her fate, if she learned to play the role they expected, they might eventually lower their guard. And when they did, she would find a way out. It was a plan that required patience. It required discipline. It required the kind of long-game thinking that most people couldn't sustain for days, let alone years. Margaret sustained it for decades. The first step was the pills. She had to stop taking them, or at least reduce the dosage enough to think clearly. But the nurses watched her swallow every medication, checked under her tongue, monitored her for the telltale signs of non-compliance. So Margaret learned to hide the pills in her cheek against her gum line in the soft tissue where casual inspection wouldn't find them. She learned to swallow dry, to mime the act of taking water while keeping the pills secure, and later alone in her room, she would spit them into her hand and hide them in the hollow leg of her bed frame. It took 3 weeks for her head to truly clear. 3 weeks of pretending to be foggy while her thoughts sharpened. 3 weeks of playing the role of the compliant patient while her rage crystallized into something cold and useful. The second step was observation. Margaret needed to understand the institution that held her, its routines, its staff, its weaknesses. She needed to know who could be trusted and who was dangerous, which doors were locked, and which were merely closed when the security was tight and when it was lax. She watched everything. She memorized schedules. She noted which orderlies were kind and which were cruel, which nurses took their jobs seriously and which cut corners. She learned that the night shift was understaffed, that the security cameras had blind spots, that budget cuts had left maintenance undone and locks unreliable. This information, useless in the short term, would become priceless over time. The third step was performance. Margaret had to convince her captors that she was healing, that the treatment was working, that she had accepted her situation. "I understand now why I needed help," she told Dr. Kessler during their monthly evaluation. The grief, the pregnancy, it was too much for me to process alone. I'm grateful for the care I've received. Kessler made a note and she saw him relax slightly. This was what he wanted to hear. This was the script he needed her to follow. "And your daughter, how do you feel about the adoption?" Margaret forced herself to smile, to let tears well in her eyes. Tears of apparent acceptance rather than the fury that burned beneath. "It was the right decision. I wasn't capable of caring for her. She's better off with a stable family." "Excellent progress, Mrs. Sullivan. I'll note in your chart that you're responding well to treatment." He never noticed that she had stopped taking her medication. He never suspected that behind her compliant smile, Margaret was cataloging his every word, his every habit, his every weakness. She would need that information later, when the time came for revenge. Now let me tell you something important about Margaret Sullivan. Something that explains how she survived what would have broken most people. Margaret had grown up poor. Her father had died when she was 6, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on a waitress's salary. They had lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, shared bathrooms with neighbors, worn clothes from church donations, learned early that the world did not give second chances to people like them. But Margaret's mother, Sophie, had taught her something that poverty couldn't take away. "Never let them see you break," her mother had said. "They can take your money, they can take your dignity, they can take everything you own, but they can only take your spirit if you let them. You decide who you are, Margaret, nobody else." Margaret had carried those words through a childhood of struggle, through a scholarship to college that changed her trajectory, through a chance meeting with Daniel Sullivan at a gallery opening where she had been working as a server, and he had been the guest of honor. Daniel had seen something in her that night, not the poor girl pretending she belonged, but the fierce intelligence she had learned to hide. He had asked her to dinner, then to another dinner, then to marry him, and he had never, not once in their 15 years together, made her feel like less than his equal. Now in this psychiatric prison, Margaret called on every lesson her mother had taught her. She called on the survival skills she had learned as a child, the resilience that had carried her from poverty to prosperity. She called on the love Daniel had given her, the strength of the life they had built together. And she waited. The first year was the hardest. Margaret was still learning the rhythms of the institution, still perfecting her performance, still grieving for the daughter she had held for only 4 minutes. She wrote letters to lawyers, to courts, to anyone who might listen, but none of them were ever sent. She requested hearings, demanded her legal rights, filed complaint after complaint. All of them disappeared into the institution's bureaucracy, never to emerge. Thomas visited once in the 3rd month of her confinement. He came with papers, power of attorney, property transfers, documents that would give him legal control over everything Margaret owned. "Just sign them," he said, sliding the stack across the table in the visitation room. "Make this easy on yourself, Maggie. You're going to be here for a long time. Let me take care of the business side of things." Margaret looked at the papers, then at her brother-in-law. She thought about Sophie alone somewhere with strangers. She thought about Daniel betrayed by his own blood. She thought about the house on Maple Street hiding secrets that Thomas would tear apart walls to find. No. Maggie, be reasonable. I said no. She pushed the papers back across the table. "I will die in here before I give you my home, before I give you anything that belonged to Daniel." Thomas's face reddened with anger. "You're making a mistake. The mistake was trusting you. I won't make it again. We'll see about that. He gathered the papers, stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. Victoria wanted me to tell you the house has been thoroughly searched. Whatever Daniel was hiding, we're going to find it, with or without your help. Margaret said nothing, but inside she felt a small flame of satisfaction. They had searched the house. They hadn't found anything. Daniel's secrets were still safe. The years passed. Margaret marked them by the changing of seasons she glimpsed through her barred window, by the rotation of staff members who came and went, by the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually become her weapon. She learned that Thomas and Victoria's search of the house had been extensive but unsuccessful. She overheard orderlies talking about that crazy Sullivan woman whose family kept sending people to look through the old mansion on Maple Street. Walls had been torn open, floors had been pulled up, the house had been gutted and put back together and gutted again. Nothing. They found nothing. Margaret allowed herself moments of bitter triumph. Daniel had been clever, cleverer than his brother had ever given him credit for. Whatever he had hidden well enough that people looking for it with hammers and crowbars would never find it. But she would. When she finally got out, when she finally went home, she would find exactly what Daniel had left for her. 10 years passed, then 15, then 20. Margaret aged in that institution. Her dark hair turned to gray, then to white. Her body, weakened by inadequate food and forced inactivity, developed the aches and limitations of advancing years. She watched other patients come and go, some released, some transferred, some carried out in body bags. But she remained. Patient 4471C, the Sullivan woman, the one who had been there so long that new staff members assumed she had always been there, would always be there, as permanent as the walls themselves. She watched Dr. Kessler retire in 2008, replaced by a younger physician who barely glanced at her chart before continuing the same medications, the same routine, the same imprisonment that Kessler had established. She watched Thomas and Victoria stop visiting entirely, apparently satisfied that she would never be a threat to their plans. And she waited. At 63, Margaret overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two nurses were talking in the hallway outside her room, discussing a county audit of long-term patients. Liability issues. Properties that had never been properly transferred. One of them mentioned that old woman in 4471C and the house that was still listed under her name. Margaret kept her eyes closed, her breathing steady, but her heart raced. The house was still hers. After 30 years, after all the searching and the scheming, Thomas and Victoria had never managed to legally claim the property. The forged documents they had filed had been rejected due to inconsistencies. The house sat in legal limbo, abandoned, decaying, but still belonging to Margaret Sullivan. If she could get out, if she could get home, if she could find what Daniel had hidden, she might still be able to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. But she was 63 years old, weakened by decades of institutional life, with no money, no identification, no allies in the outside world. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. Margaret Sullivan had never been stopped by obstacles before. She began planning her escape. It took 5 years to prepare. 5 years of careful observation of hoarded coins and crumpled bills of stolen maintenance coveralls and memorized schedules. 5 years of pretending to be the compliant patient while her mind worked constantly on the puzzle of freedom. She learned that the fire exit in the east corridor had a faulty alarm. Budget cuts, the maintenance staff complained. She learned that Friday nights were understaffed, that Nurse Deborah fell asleep during her rounds, that the security camera in the east corridor had a blind spot of approximately 3 feet. She accumulated $127 coin by coin bill by bill from Christmas cards sent by a cousin who occasionally remembered her from dropped change. That patients weren't supposed to keep from small tips pressed into her hand by visitors who pitied the old woman without family. And she waited for the right moment. It came on a Friday in October, 68 years old now. And also when rain had been falling since noon and the outdoor staff had retreated inside. At 11:47 p.m., Margaret Sullivan rose from her bed for the last time. She moved through the darkened corridors in her stolen coverall, walking with the steady pace of someone who belonged there. Past the supply closet with the faulty latch. Past the staff lounge where Deborah's sleeping silhouette was visible through the window. Past the camera with the blind spot through the fire exit that didn't alarm out onto the loading dock that led to the drainage ditch that led to Route 7. The rain was cold on her face, real rain falling from a real sky for the first time in 30 years. Margaret Sullivan began to run. Behind her, Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital squatted in the darkness holding hundreds of patients who would never know that tonight one of their own had finally broken free. Ahead of her, somewhere in the darkness, waited a house full of secrets, a fortune worth millions, and a daughter who didn't know her mother was still alive. Margaret had spent 30 years as a prisoner, Now, at 68 years old, she was finally going home. The rain soaked through Margaret's stolen coverall within minutes, but she kept moving. Her lungs burned with each breath. Her left knee, weakened by 30 years of institutional neglect, threatened to buckle with every step, but she did not stop. The drainage ditch ended at a chain-link fence. Margaret's fingers, numb with cold, found the metal links and held on while she assessed the obstacle. 6 feet tall, barbed wire at the top, impossible for a 68-year-old woman to climb. She followed the fence line, stumbling through mud and darkness until she found what she needed. A section where the ground had eroded, creating a gap barely 18 inches wide. Margaret dropped to her knees. The mud was cold thick, pulling at her like hands trying to drag her back. She army crawled through the gap, the bottom edge of the fence tearing her coverall, scraping along her back. Pain shot through her body, but she kept moving, kept pulling herself forward until she emerged on the other side. For a moment she lay in the mud and let the rain fall on her face. Real rain. Real sky. Real freedom. Then she heard the dogs. German shepherds. Pinecrest kept them for security. Their barking cut through the night, sharp and urgent, and Margaret understood that her absence had been discovered. She forced herself up. Her back screamed where the fence had torn it. Her knee wobbled dangerously. But she moved one foot, then the next, toward the distant glow of Route 7. The bus shelter appeared through the rain like a mirage. Margaret collapsed onto the bench at 12:34 a.m., her body shaking from cold and exhaustion. She counted 60 seconds of rest because counting had been one of her survival tools in the ward. At 57 seconds, headlights appeared. Margaret tensed, ready to run. But the vehicle that emerged from the darkness wasn't a security car or a police cruiser. It was a public transit bus, its destination sign reading Millbrook Central. The doors hissed open. The driver, a heavy woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Rosa, looked at Margaret's mud-streaked face and torn clothing. "Rough night, honey." "You have no idea." Rosa studied her for a long moment. Margaret waited for the questions, the suspicion, the call to police that would end everything. "Get out of the rain?" Rosa said instead. "We'll worry about fare later." Margaret sank into a seat near the back and watched the lights of Pinecrest disappear behind her. For the first time in 30 years, she was surrounded by people who had no idea who she was. No chart, no diagnosis, no patient number. She was just a tired old woman on a late-night bus. She began to cry. The journey took 3 hours. Margaret dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time the bus stopped, terrified that police would be waiting. But each station brought only ordinary passengers going about their ordinary lives, oblivious to the fugitive in their midst. At 3:47 a.m., the bus turned onto the old county road that led into Millbrook. Margaret's heart seized with recognition. Henderson's farm, smaller now, but still there. The Methodist church with its white steeple. The elementary school where Richard and Patricia had learned to read. Patricia, her daughter. Somewhere out there, a 30-year-old woman named Sophie Chen had no idea that her birth mother was still alive. "Millbrook Central," Rosa announced. "End of the line." Margaret pressed several bills into the driver's hand as she passed. More than the fare, probably, but Rosa had given her something that couldn't be repaid with money. "Whatever you're running from," Rosa said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." Margaret stepped off the bus into the rain-washed streets of the town that had once been her home. The walk to Maple Street took over an hour. Margaret's body was failing her, each step a negotiation between will and weakness. She stopped twice to rest, hiding under awnings of businesses that hadn't existed when she'd last walked these streets. At 5:23 a.m., she turned the corner onto Maple Street and stopped breathing. The Sullivan mansion stood at the end of the block like a corpse waiting to be buried. 30 years of neglect had transformed her home into a ruin. The white paint had peeled to gray. The porch roof had collapsed. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets covered with plywood that had itself begun to rot. But it was still standing. And legally and possibly, it was still hers. Margaret approached the side of the house where the kitchen door had always stuck in wet weather. Her hand found the handle rusted and resistant, and she pushed with strength she didn't know she possessed. The door groaned open. The smell hit her first. Mildew and decay layered over decades, but beneath it fainted the ghost of lemon polish and dried herbs. The smell of her own history. Margaret stepped inside. The kitchen had been destroyed. Not just by time. Cabinets hung open. Their contents scattered. The walls had holes torn through the plaster. Someone had been searching this house for years. They had never found what they were looking for. Margaret moved through the kitchen into the hallway. The wallpaper she had chosen in 1972 hung in strips, revealing older layers beneath. She touched the wall, feeling the bones of the home Daniel had loved. The living room was worse. The ceiling had partially collapsed, exposing the attic space above. The furniture was gone. Only the built-in bookshelves remained warped and water-stained, but still standing. Walter's bookshelves, the ones with the hidden compartments. Margaret crossed the room and knelt before the shelves. Her fingers found the third panel from the bottom, the one that looked like solid backing, but wasn't. She pressed the sequence Daniel had taught her. Left corner, right corner, center. Hold for 3 seconds. Click. The panel swung open. Inside was a metal lockbox, its surface dulled by time, but otherwise intact. Beside it, wrapped in plastic, was a manila envelope, and beneath both, a cassette tape in a clear case. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for them. Daniel had known. Somehow impossibly Daniel had known that she would need this. She opened the envelope first. Inside were documents. The original deed to the house with both their signatures. Financial records going back decades. And a letter in Daniel's handwriting. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, I wasn't wrong about them. Thomas has been asking questions about my collection for months. He knows it's worth a fortune, but he doesn't know where I've hidden it. Everything you need is here. The deed are financial records and recordings of conversations I had with Thomas. He didn't know I was taping. What he said about his plans, about what he was willing to do to get his hands on our money, Maggie, I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner. The key opens our beginning. Remember where we started? The house knows Maggie. The house remembers everything. I love you. I've loved you since I was 32 years old, and you walked into that gallery in your borrowed dress, pretending you belonged. You did belong. You always belonged with me. Find what I've hidden. Use it to destroy them. Forever yours. Daniel. The letter was dated 6 months before Daniel's death. 6 months before the car accident that Margaret was now certain had been no accident at all. Her hands found the lockbox. Inside, and it was cash bundled and old but still legal tender. Thousands of dollars. An emergency fund that Daniel had never told her about. And at the bottom of the box, a single key on a worn leather cord. The key opens our beginning. Margaret knew exactly where it led. If you're still with me, stay close. Because what Margaret discovers next changes everything she thought she knew about her husband, her family, and the fortune that destroyed them all. At 7:12 a.m., Margaret heard footsteps outside. She froze, clutching the lockbox to her chest. Had they found her already? Had the police traced her to Millbrook? A voice called out. Hello, is someone in there? Not police, a woman's voice, elderly concerned. I saw movement through the window, the voice continued. This house has been empty for 30 years. If you're squatting here, I'm going to have to call the authorities. Margaret considered hiding, but she was exhausted, injured, and running out of options. If this neighbor was going to call the police anyway, maybe it was better to face her directly. She moved to the front door and opened it. An elderly woman stood on the porch, white-haired and sharp-eyed, wrapped in a bathrobe despite the cold. She looked at Margaret's mud-streaked face, her torn coverall, her wild white hair, and her expression shifted from suspicion to shock. Good Lord, the woman whispered. Margaret Sullivan. Margaret stared at her. The face was familiar, aged by 30 years, but unmistakable. Dorothy Henderson. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. They told us you were dead. Thomas said you had died in the hospital years ago. He said... She stopped, her eyes filling with tears. You're alive. After all this time, you're alive. I was never dead, Dorothy. I was locked away. Thomas and Victoria had me committed to steal everything Daniel left me. I knew it. Dorothy's voice hardened. I knew something wasn't right. The way they tore this house apart, the way they kept coming back year after year, searching for God knows what. I told Harold before he passed, I said there's something wrong about that whole family. Dorothy, I need help. I escaped from Pinecrest last night. The police will be looking for me, if anyone knows I'm here. Come with me. Dorothy reached for Margaret's arm. Right now, before anyone sees you. Margaret hesitated. 30 years of institutional paranoia screamed that this was a trap that Dorothy would call Thomas or Victoria the moment Margaret let her guard down. But Dorothy Henderson had been her neighbor for 15 years before the commitment. She had brought casseroles when Daniel was sick, had sat with Margaret during the funeral, had been the one person who looked genuinely concerned when Thomas announced that Margaret was being sent away for treatment. Sometimes you have to trust someone, even when trust has been beaten out of you. Margaret followed Dorothy across the overgrown yard and into the warmth of the Henderson house. Dorothy sat Margaret down at her kitchen table and placed a cup of hot coffee in front of her without asking. The warmth of it, the simple normalcy of it, nearly broke Margaret's composure entirely. Start from the beginning, Dorothy said. Tell me everything. So Margaret did. She told Dorothy about the commitment, about Dr. Kessler's fraudulent evaluation about the birth of her daughter, and the 4 minutes she had been allowed to hold her. She told her about the 30 years of captivity, the pills she had hidden, the escape through the rain-soaked darkness. And she told her about Daniel's letter, about the hidden documents, about the key that opened their beginning. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, the old woman's face was set with fury. "Those monsters," she said. "Those absolute monsters. And I had them in my home, Margaret. Thomas and Victoria came by 5-6 years ago asking questions about you. Whether you'd ever mentioned any safe deposit boxes. Whether Daniel had any storage facilities I knew about. I thought they were just trying to settle the estate." She shook her head. "I should have known." "The key, Margaret said, pulling it from her pocket. "Daniel said it opens our beginning. Our honeymoon was in Newport. There's a bed and breakfast there where we stayed for 2 weeks after our wedding. If Daniel hid something there..." "Newport is 200 miles away. You can't drive, you have no identification, and the police are looking for you." Dorothy drummed her fingers on the table. "But I can drive, and I have a granddaughter who works at the library. She's good with computers, good at finding things. If there's information out there about what Thomas and Victoria have been doing for 30 years, she can find it." "Why would you help me? This could get you in serious trouble." Dorothy's eyes met Margaret's. "Because I'm 84 years old, and I've spent too much of my life minding my own business while bad things happen to good people. Harold was the same way. Don't get involved, Dorothy. It's not our problem." "Well, he's gone now, and I'm tired of not getting involved." She stood up. "First things first. You need a shower, clean clothes, and some food in you. Then we're going to make a plan." For the first time in 30 years, Margaret felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. At 2:15 p.m., Dorothy's granddaughter arrived. Elena Martinez was 28 years old with sharp features and sharper eyes that reminded Margaret painfully of herself at that age. She worked as a reference librarian at the Millbrook Public Library, but her real passion, Dorothy explained, was investigative research. "Grandma told me what happened to you," Elena said, setting up her laptop at Dorothy's kitchen table. "She also told me what you're looking for. I started digging before I came over." "What did you find?" Elena turned the laptop so Margaret could see the screen. Dr. Raymond Kessler retired from Pinecrest in 2008. He's currently 83 years old, living in a luxury retirement community called Silver Oaks. His income during his working years doesn't match his current lifestyle. Someone was paying him a lot of money under the table. Thomas and Victoria. That's what I'm trying to prove. Elena clicked to another page. Thomas Sullivan filed for bankruptcy twice, in 2003 and 2011. He's currently living in Florida, address unknown. Victoria Sullivan is now Victoria Sullivan Hayes. She married a gallery owner named Marcus Hayes in 2015 and is currently one of the most prominent art dealers in Manhattan. Art dealer, just like Daniel had been. "What about the house?" Margaret asked. "The property records." "Still in your name. There have been multiple attempts to transfer ownership over the years, but they were all rejected due to inconsistencies in the documentation. The house is technically abandoned, but it belongs to you. The county has filed liens for unpaid property taxes, but they can't seize it without a clear title. And my daughter, Sophie?" Elena's expression softened. "I found her. Sophie Chen, born March 15, 1994, adopted through a private agency called Bright Futures Family Services. She's 30 years old now, living in Boston. She works as an art restoration specialist at the Museum of Fine Arts." Art restoration. Working with the same kinds of pieces that Daniel had traded that Thomas and Victoria had been searching for all these years. Coincidence? Margaret didn't believe in coincidences anymore. "There's something else," Elena said. Bright Futures Family Services was shut down in 2007 after allegations of improper practices. Falsified records, children placed without proper legal procedures. The woman who ran the agency was connected to several prominent families in the art world. "Victoria arranged the adoption," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "Almost certainly. The records are sealed, but there are ways to unseal them, especially if we can prove that the original commitment was fraudulent." Elena leaned forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, what you're describing? False commitment, bribery, theft of property, potentially even murder. If Daniel's accident wasn't an accident, these are serious crimes. Some of them might be past the statute of limitations, but civil suits don't have the same restrictions. And if we can prove a pattern of behavior, we might be able to bring criminal charges for conspiracy." My grandmother says you need help. I've spent 5 years watching corrupt people get away with things because nobody was willing to dig deep enough to stop them." Elena's jaw set. "I'm willing to dig." "Huh." Margaret looked at this young woman, this stranger, who was offering to risk everything for a cause that wasn't her own. She thought about Rosa, the bus driver, about Dorothy Henderson, about all the small kindnesses that had carried her this far. Daniel's letter mentioned recordings, Margaret said. Conversations with Thomas. If those tapes still work, they might contain evidence of what Thomas was planning before Daniel died. Where are they? In the house, hidden in the lockbox with the other documents. I also have a key that Daniel said opens our beginning. I think it leads to a safe deposit box in Newport where we spent our honeymoon. Elena nodded. We need to move fast. If the police are looking for you, they'll eventually connect you to this address. We need to get to Newport, find whatever Daniel hid, and establish your case before anyone realizes you're here. How do we get to Newport without being caught? Dorothy, who had been listening silently, spoke up. I have a car, an old Ford that Harold bought in 1992. It's not registered to anyone connected to you, and the plates are current. We can be in Newport by tonight. Grandma, you can't drive 200 miles. Your hip, my hip is my business. Dorothy's tone brooked no argument. Margaret Sullivan was my neighbor for 15 years. She was my friend, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sit in this house while she fights alone. At 4:30 p.m., Margaret Sullivan climbed into the passenger seat of a 1992 Ford Taurus and headed for Newport, Rhode Island. Dorothy drove. Elena sat in the back with her laptop continuing her research as they traveled. Margaret watched the Connecticut landscape scroll past the window and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 18 hours. 18 hours ago, she had been patient 4471C. Now she was a fugitive on her way to uncover a fortune that had been hidden for 30 years. I found something, Elena said from the back seat. About Daniel's business. Margaret turned. What? Your husband was under investigation by the FBI in 1993. Did you know that? No, he never. What kind of investigation? Elena scrolled through her laptop. It looks like it was related to the provenance of certain artworks he was dealing. Questions about where some of his pieces originally came from, whether they might have been looted during World War II. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Are you saying Daniel was dealing in stolen art? Not exactly. It's more complicated than that. Elena leaned forward. After the war, thousands of artworks that had been seized by the Nazis ended up in limbo. Some were recovered and returned to their original owners, but a lot of them disappeared into private collections, black markets, legal gray areas. A young American soldier named Joseph Sullivan, that would be Daniel's father, was part of a unit that helped recover some of these pieces. Daniel never talked about his father's service. There might be a reason for that. According to these records, Joseph Sullivan was investigated in 1947 for allegedly keeping some of the artworks he was supposed to be cataloging. The investigation was dropped for lack of evidence, but there were rumors that he had hidden a significant collection somewhere in the United States. Margaret thought about Daniel's letter, about the fortune that Thomas and Victoria had been searching for, about the key that opened their beginning. You're saying Daniel inherited a collection of looted art from his father. I'm saying it's possible, and if that collection still exists, if it's been sitting somewhere for 70 years, it could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Elena's voice dropped. That would explain why Thomas and Victoria were so desperate to find it, and why they were willing to destroy you to get it. The car was silent for a long moment. Daniel would never have dealt in stolen art, Margaret said finally. He was a good man. He believed in doing things the right way. Maybe he didn't know where the pieces originally came from. Or maybe he was trying to figure out how to return them to their rightful owners without destroying his father's reputation. Elena shrugged. Either way, there's a fortune out there somewhere. And if we can find it before Victoria does, we can use it to take back everything they stole from you. They arrived in Newport at 9:47 p.m. The Cliffside Inn, where Daniel and Margaret had spent their honeymoon 35 years ago, had been renovated since she'd last seen it. But the basic structure was the same, a Victorian manor overlooking the ocean, with rooms named after flowers and a garden where Daniel had first told her he loved her. Margaret approached the front desk, painfully aware of how she must look, despite the clean clothes Dorothy had provided. An old woman with wild white hair, no identification, no reservation, asking about a safe deposit box that had been opened 3 decades ago. I'm sorry, the young man behind the desk said politely. We don't have any safe deposit facilities here. We're just a bed and breakfast. This would have been set up in 1989, a private arrangement possibly. My husband's name was Daniel Sullivan. The young man shook his head. I've only been here 2 years. You'd have to ask the owner. Is the owner available? She's in the back. Let me check. He disappeared through a door, and Margaret waited, her heart pounding. If Daniel had hidden something here, it had been hidden for 35 years. The people who had helped him might be dead. The hiding place might have been discovered. Everything might have been for nothing. The door opened and an elderly woman emerged. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair and kind eyes that widened when she saw Margaret. "Good Lord," she whispered. "You're her. You're the woman in the photograph." "I'm sorry. Daniel Sullivan's wife. He showed me a picture of you when he came here. He said—" She stopped, seemed to gather herself. "He said that if anyone ever came looking for what he'd left, it would be you. He said no matter what anyone told me, no matter how many years passed, I should only give it to you." Margaret's legs went weak. She gripped the edge of the desk for support. "When did he come here, 1993, about a year before he died. He paid me to keep something safe. He said his wife would come for it eventually and that I should trust no one else." The woman's voice trembled. "I'm Eleanor Ashford. I've been keeping your husband's secret for 30 years. It's in the basement exactly where he left it." Margaret followed Eleanor Ashford down a narrow staircase into the basement of the Cliffside Inn. The space had been converted into storage filled with old furniture and boxes. But in the far corner, behind a stack of broken chairs, was a door that Margaret hadn't noticed at first. Eleanor produced a key that matched the one Daniel had left in the lockbox. "He made 2 copies, Eleanor explained. "One for me to keep the room secure. One for you to open it when you came." The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung open. Inside was a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 12, climate-controlled and carefully maintained. And covering every wall stacked in careful rows wrapped in acid-free paper and protective cases were paintings. Dozens of paintings. Margaret stepped into the room, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized some of the pieces immediately. A Monet water lily series she had seen in art history textbooks. A Klimt portrait that had been declared lost after World War II. Works by Picasso, Renoir, Matisse, a collection that spanned decades and represented some of the most sought-after pieces in the art world. "Daniel's father brought these back from Europe," Eleanor said quietly. "Daniel spent 20 years trying to figure out who they originally belonged to. He wanted to return them, but the provenance was complicated. Some of the original owners had died in the camps. Their descendants were scattered across the world. He was working with lawyers and historians to trace everything when he died." "How much is this worth?" "When Daniel first showed it to me, he estimated around $50 million. But that was 30 years ago. Now," Eleanor shook her head, "I'm not an expert, but I've kept up with the art market. If these pieces are what Daniel believed they were, you're looking at $300 million, maybe more. $300 million. Thomas and Victoria had torn apart the Sullivan mansion for 30 years searching for this fortune. They had destroyed Margaret's life, stolen her daughter, possibly murdered her husband, all for a treasure that had been sitting in a bed and breakfast basement 200 miles away." "There's something else," Eleanor said. "Daniel left instructions. He wanted you to use this collection to make things right. Return what could be returned. Sell what couldn't. Use the money to rebuild your life and to help others who had been wronged the way you were wronged." Margaret looked at the paintings surrounding her. A lifetime of hidden beauty. A fortune built on tragedy and theft preserved by a man who had wanted to do the right thing but had run out of time. "I'm going to finish what he started," Margaret said. "I'm going to return every piece that can be traced to its original owners. And then I'm going to use whatever is left to destroy the people who took everything from me." Eleanor nodded. "Daniel said you'd say that. He also said to remind you of something." "What?" "He said, tell her that revenge is a dish best served cold, but justice is a meal that feeds everyone." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Even after 30 years, even from beyond the grave, Daniel knew her better than anyone. She wiped her eyes and turned to face the collection that would change everything. "Call Elena," she said. "Tell her we found it, and tell her to start making a list of every person Thomas and Victoria have ever worked with, every deal they've ever made, every secret they've ever tried to bury." Eleanor smiled. "What are you going to do?" Margaret looked at the paintings one more time. $300 million. 30 years of suffering. One chance to make it right. "I'm going to burn their world to the ground." The drive back to Connecticut took 4 hours. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her mind racing faster than the car could travel. $300 million. 47 paintings. 30 years of secrets finally exposed. Elena had already started making calls from the back seat. Her voice was urgent, professional, transforming from a small-town librarian into something far more dangerous. "I need to speak with Rachel Park at the Hartford Legal Aid Society," Elena said into her phone. Tell her it's about a wrongful commitment case with evidence of criminal conspiracy. Tell her the evidence includes documented bribery and a fortune in recovered artwork. Margaret turned to look at her. You know someone at Legal Aid. Rachel was my roommate in college. She became a civil rights lawyer because she watched her own grandmother get cheated out of her home by a crooked developer. Elena's jaw tightened. She's been waiting for a case like this her entire career. At 2:17 a.m., they arrived back at Dorothy's house in Millbrook. Rachel Park was already waiting on the porch. She was younger than Margaret expected. Mid-30s with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. She stood when the car pulled up and walked directly to Margaret with her hand extended. Mrs. Sullivan, Elena told me everything. I'm going to help you take back what's yours. Margaret shook her hand. The grip was firm, confident. You understand what we're up against. Thomas and Victoria have money connections lawyers who charge more per hour than most people earn in a week. I understand exactly what we're up against. Rachel's voice carried an edge of steel. I also understand that they've been committing crimes for 30 years, and nobody has ever held them accountable. That ends now. Inside Dorothy's kitchen, Rachel spread documents across the table and began building Margaret's case piece by piece. The commitment papers from 1994 are the foundation, Rachel explained. Dr. Kessler's evaluation was fraudulent. We have his own letter admitting that he was paid to falsify his findings. That alone is enough to challenge your commitment status and establish that you were illegally imprisoned. But the statute of limitations has run out on most criminal charges. Yes, but civil liability is different, and more importantly, if we can prove that the fraudulent commitment was part of a larger conspiracy to steal your property, we can pursue charges for ongoing criminal enterprise. Rachel looked up. Thomas and Victoria didn't just commit crimes 30 years ago. They've been maintaining those crimes ever since. Every year they filed paperwork trying to claim your house. Every year they continued to benefit from your imprisonment. That's not a single crime, it's a pattern. Elena pulled up something on her laptop. I found the connection we needed. Bright Futures Family Services, the adoption agency that placed Sophie, was run by a woman named Catherine Wells. Catherine Wells was Victoria Sullivan's college roommate. Margaret felt her hands curl into fists. Victoria arranged the adoption personally. It gets worse. Catherine Wells received a payment of $50,000 from an account registered to Thomas Sullivan 3 days after Sophie was born. The payment was listed as a charitable donation, but the timing is too perfect to be coincidence. They bought my daughter, Margaret whispered. They sold her like she was property. Rachel reached across the table and touched Margaret's arm. We're going to get her back. We're going to expose everything they did. But first, we need to establish your legal standing. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing an emergency motion to vacate your commitment order based on new evidence of fraud. Once that's granted, you're no longer a fugitive. You're a victim. How long will that take? With the evidence we have, I can have a hearing scheduled within 72 hours. At 6:45 a.m., Margaret called Sophie Chen. She had been staring at the phone number for hours, trying to find the right words. What did you say to a daughter you had held for 4 minutes 30 years ago? How did you explain that you had never abandoned her, that you had spent 3 decades trying to find a way back to her? In the end, there were no right words. There was only the truth. Sophie answered on the third ring. Her voice was groggy with sleep, confused. Hello. Sophie, my name is Margaret Sullivan. I know this is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen to me. I'm your biological mother. Silence on the other end. Then, is this some kind of joke? I wish it were. Sophie, I was committed to a psychiatric hospital when I was 7 months pregnant with you. I held you for 4 minutes after you were born before they took you away. I've spent 30 years trying to find you. My birth mother died. Sophie's voice had gone cold. My parents told me that when I was old enough to ask. They lied to you, or they were lied to. Sophie, I have documents. I have proof of everything that happened. Your adoption was arranged by a woman named Victoria Sullivan, who conspired with my brother-in-law to have me falsely committed so they could steal my husband's estate. This is insane. I don't know who you are or what you want, but your father's name was Daniel Sullivan. He was an art dealer in Hartford. He died in a car accident 3 weeks before you were born. You have his dark hair and my green eyes. You work as an art restoration specialist because somewhere inside you there's a connection to him that nobody ever explained. The line went quiet. Margaret could hear Sophie breathing, could sense the war happening inside her between the story she had always believed and the impossible truth being offered. How do you know where I work? I've been researching everything I could find about you since I escaped from Pinecrest 2 days ago. Sophie, I know this is overwhelming. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I'm asking you to meet me. Just once. Let me show you the evidence. Let me tell you the whole story. And then if you want me to leave you alone, I will. Another long silence. Where are you, Connecticut? At a friend's house in Millbrook. I can be there by tomorrow afternoon, but I'm warning you, if this is some kind of scam, if you're trying to get money or attention or whatever, I'm not asking for anything except the chance to meet my daughter. Margaret's voice cracked. I've been waiting 30 years for this. Please. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Text me the address. The line went dead. Margaret set down the phone and discovered she was crying. At 9:30 a.m., Rachel Park filed her emergency motion at the Hartford Superior Court. The motion was 47 pages long, detailing every piece of evidence they had assembled. Dr. Kessler's letter admitting to bribery, the forged commitment papers, the pattern of attempted property theft spanning 3 decades, the connection between Victoria Sullivan and the adoption agency that had taken Margaret's daughter. By noon, the motion had been assigned to Judge Harold Washington, a 63-year-old jurist known for his intolerance of institutional corruption. By 2:00 p.m., Judge Washington had issued an emergency order suspending Margaret's commitment status pending a full hearing. By 3:00 p.m., the story had leaked to the press. Elena burst through Dorothy's kitchen door with her phone in her hand. Someone at the courthouse talked. There's already a reporter asking questions about a psychiatric patient who escaped and is claiming she was falsely imprisoned for 30 years. Is that good or bad? Dorothy asked. It's complicated. Elena scrolled through her phone. Public attention can protect Margaret. It's harder to make someone disappear quietly when everyone is watching. But it also tips off Victoria and Thomas. They'll know we're coming. Let them know, Margaret said. Her voice was steady, cold. Let them spend the next 72 hours wondering what we have on them. Let them feel what I felt for 30 years, the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that everything they built is about to be destroyed. Rachel nodded. I'll prepare a statement for the press. We control the narrative from here on out. At 4:47 p.m., Margaret's phone rang. The number was unlisted. She answered anyway. Hello, Margaret, Victoria's voice. After 30 years, Margaret would have recognized it anywhere, that smooth, controlled tone that had always hidden calculation beneath courtesy. Victoria. I see you've been busy. Lawyers, reporters, dramatic courtroom filings. Very impressive for someone who's been locked away for 3 decades. I had a lot of time to plan. I'm sure you did. Victoria's voice sharpened slightly. I'm also sure you think you know what you're doing, but you don't. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I'm dealing with people who stole 30 years of my life, who took my daughter, who may have murdered my husband. I think I understand perfectly. Daniel's death was an accident. Was it because I have recordings of Thomas talking about how inconvenient Daniel had become? How he wished something would just happen to solve the problem. The line went silent. Margaret felt a surge of grim satisfaction. She was guessing about the contents of the tapes. She hadn't had a chance to listen to them yet, but Victoria's reaction confirmed her suspicions. What do you want? Victoria asked finally. I want my daughter back. I want my house back. I want everyone who participated in destroying my life to face consequences. And if I can't give you those things, then I give everything I have to the FBI, the recordings, the financial documents, the evidence of Thomas paying Dr. Kessler, the connection between you and the adoption agency. Margaret paused. And the art collection. Victoria's breath caught. Just barely, but Margaret heard it. What art collection? The one Daniel hid before he died. The one you and Thomas have been tearing my house apart to find for 30 years. I found it, Victoria. 47 paintings worth $300 million, all of them with documented provenance going back to their original owners, all of them about to be returned to the families your father-in-law stole them from. You're bluffing. Am I call Thomas? Ask him why he's been so obsessed with finding what Daniel left behind. Ask him about the Nazi-looted art that Joseph Sullivan brought back from Europe. Ask him how long he's known about the fortune that's been sitting just out of his reach. This conversation is over. No, Victoria, it's just beginning. I'll see you in court. Margaret hung up. Rachel, who had been listening from across the table, let out a long breath. That was either brilliant or incredibly dangerous. It was necessary. Victoria needs to know that I'm not the scared, helpless woman they locked away 30 years ago. She needs to understand that this time I'm the one in control. And the art collection, you really found it. $300 million worth of paintings hidden in a climate-controlled room in Newport. Daniel's father brought them back from Europe after the war. Daniel spent years trying to figure out how to return them to their rightful owners. That changes everything. Rachel's mind was clearly racing. The provenance of looted art is incredibly complex. Some of those pieces might have legitimate claims from multiple families, but if we can document where they came from, if we can show that Daniel was trying to do the right thing, then we control the narrative. We're not just victims fighting for justice. We're the people trying to right a 70-year-old wrong. At 7:15 p.m., the local news ran a segment about Margaret's case. Dorothy had turned on the television in her living room and they all gathered to watch. The anchor, a young woman with carefully styled hair and a serious expression, led with the story. A dramatic development tonight in a case that spans 3 decades. 68-year-old Margaret Sullivan, who escaped from Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital earlier this week, is now claiming that she was falsely committed in 1994 as part of a conspiracy to steal her late husband's estate. Court documents filed today allege that Dr. Raymond Kessler, the psychiatrist who evaluated Mrs. Sullivan, accepted bribes to falsify his medical findings. The screen cut to a photograph of Margaret from 1994, young, beautiful, pregnant. The contrast with the woman watching the broadcast was stark. Mrs. Sullivan's attorney, Rachel Park, released a statement earlier today claiming that her client has evidence implicating prominent Manhattan art dealer Victoria Sullivan Hayes in the conspiracy. Mrs. Sullivan Hayes was reached for comment but declined to speak on the record. Elena leaned forward. This is good. The more public attention, the harder it is for them to bury this. It's also putting a target on our backs, Rachel said quietly. Victoria has resources. If she feels cornered, she might do something desperate. Let her try. Margaret's voice was calm. I've survived 30 years of being locked away. I'm not afraid of Victoria Sullivan. At 10:22 p.m., Dorothy's doorbell rang. Elena answered it. Standing on the porch was a man in his late 60s, thin and nervous, clutching a briefcase against his chest like a shield. I need to speak with Margaret Sullivan, he said. My name is Gerald Foster. I was Dr. Raymond Kessler's assistant in 1994. I know what happened to her. I've known for 30 years and I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't stay silent anymore. If you're still with me at this point in the story, stay close, because what Gerald Foster reveals next will change everything Margaret thought she knew about the people who destroyed her life. Gerald Foster sat at Dorothy's kitchen table, his hands shaking around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I was 26 years old when I started working for Dr. Kessler, he said. Fresh out of medical school, still idealistic, still believing that psychiatry was about helping people. Dr. Kessler seemed like a mentor, respected, established everything I wanted to be. What changed? Rachel asked. Mrs. Sullivan. She was my first real patient. I was in the room during her evaluation. I watched Dr. Kessler ask her questions and write down answers that had nothing to do with what she actually said. Gerald's voice cracked. She was completely lucid. Grieving, yes. Frightened, certainly. But not mentally ill? Anyone could see that. You didn't say anything. I tried. After the evaluation, I told Dr. Kessler that I was concerned about his findings. He laughed at me. He said I was too inexperienced to understand the subtleties of psychiatric diagnosis. And then he told me that if I ever questioned him again, he would make sure I never worked in medicine. Gerald set down his coffee cup and opened his briefcase. Inside were folders, dozens of them packed with documents. I started keeping copies. Every patient I had concerns about every evaluation that seemed wrong, every payment that didn't make sense. I told myself I was building a case that someday I would expose him. But I never did. I was too afraid. He spread the documents across the table. 17 patients over 12 years. All of them committed on questionable evidence. All of them with family members who wanted something they had. Property, insurance money, inheritances. He pointed to one folder. Thomas Sullivan paid Dr. Kessler $50,000 3 weeks before Mrs. Sullivan's evaluation. I have the bank records. Rachel grabbed the folder and began flipping through it. Her eyes widened. This is exactly what we needed. Direct evidence of the payment dated and documented. There's more. Gerald pulled out another folder. I found records of communication between Dr. Kessler and Victoria Sullivan. Not Thomas Victoria. She was the one coordinating everything. Thomas was just the front man. Margaret leaned forward. What do you mean, Thomas Sullivan is weak. He always was. Victoria saw an opportunity when Daniel started asking questions about his father's art collection. She knew that if Daniel discovered the truth about where those paintings came from, he would try to return them. She couldn't allow that, so she started planning. Planning what? Gerald's face went pale. Daniel's accident. I have a memo from Dr. Kessler to Victoria dated 1 week before Daniel died. It references the situation being resolved permanently. The kitchen went silent. You're saying Victoria had Daniel killed, Margaret said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I can't prove it directly, but the timing, the communication, the way everything fell into place, afterward, it wasn't coincidence. Daniel was asking too many questions. He was threatening to expose the stolen art collection. So Victoria eliminated him and then eliminated you. At 11:58 p.m., Margaret listened to the cassette tapes from Daniel's lockbox. Elena had found an old tape player at a thrift store earlier that day. Now sitting alone in Dorothy's living room while the others slept, Margaret pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room. Young, vibrant, alive. The voice of the man she had loved preserved on magnetic tape for 30 years. This recording is dated September 15, 1993. I'm documenting this conversation because I believe my life may be in danger. Margaret pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart pound. My brother Thomas came to visit today. He brought Victoria. They wanted to discuss family business, specifically our father's art collection. I've always known the collection existed. Dad told me about it before he died, told me where he'd hidden it, made me promise to figure out what to do with it. I've spent 20 years researching the provenance of those pieces. Most of them were looted during the war. They belonged to families who lost everything. Thomas's voice cut in, captured by whatever hidden device Daniel had used. You can't just give them back. Do you have any idea what those paintings are worth? I know exactly what they're worth, and I know what keeping them would make us. Nobody knows where they came from. The trail is 70 years cold. We could sell them quietly, split the proceeds. No. I'm working with lawyers to establish proper provenance. Once that's done, I'm returning every piece I can trace to its original owners. Like hell you are. Victoria's voice joined the conversation, smooth, controlled, calculating. Daniel, be reasonable. Thomas is right. This is a family matter, and families should benefit from family assets. There's no need to involve lawyers or historians or anyone else. The decision is made, Victoria. I've already started the process. In 6 months, the collection will be transferred to a foundation that will handle the restitution. And Maggie, does she know about any of this? Not yet. I'm going to tell her everything when the time is right. She deserves to know the truth about my family. I see. The recording ended. Margaret sat in the darkness, tears streaming down her face. Daniel had been trying to do the right thing. He had been trying to make amends for his father's crimes, and Thomas and Victoria had killed him for it. The next tape was dated October 3rd, 1993. Thomas called me today. He was agitated, almost frantic. He said he needed money urgently, that his businesses were failing, that he would lose everything if I didn't help him. I offered to loan him $50,000. He laughed. He said $50,000 was nothing. He needed millions. When I said I couldn't help him with that kind of money, he said something that chilled me to the bone. A pause on the tape, then Daniel's voice quieter. He said, one way or another, I'm going to get what Dad left behind. If you won't give it to me, I'll find another way. I asked him what he meant by that. He hung up. Margaret stopped the tape. Daniel had known. 3 months before his death, Daniel had known that his brother was dangerous. And he had hidden the collection, hidden the evidence, prepared for the worst, but he hadn't prepared well enough. The final tape was dated December 28, 1993, 3 weeks before Daniel's fatal car accident. If you're listening to this, Maggie, then I was right to be afraid. Thomas and Victoria have been following me. I've seen their car outside my office. I've caught Victoria going through my study when she thought I wasn't home. They're looking for the collection, and they're running out of patience. Daniel's voice trembled slightly. I've moved everything to a safe location. You know where the place where we started. Eleanor will keep it safe until you can claim it. I've also hidden documents in the house in our special place. The bookshelf compartment. Everything you need to understand what happened is there. A long pause. I love you, Maggie. I love our baby. Whatever happens to me, please believe that I did everything I could to protect you both. Find the collection, use it to make things right, and take care of our daughter. Tell her that her father loved her even though he never got to hold her. The tape clicked off. Margaret sat alone in the darkness, holding the evidence of her husband's murder in her hands. At 2:00 p.m. the next day, Sophie Chen arrived at Dorothy's house. Margaret watched through the window as a car pulled up to the curb. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. 30 years. 30 years of wondering what Sophie looked like, who she had become, whether she was happy. The car door opened and a young woman stepped out. She was beautiful. Dark hair like Daniel's, cut short and practical. Green eyes like Margaret's, sharp and assessing. She moved with the careful precision of someone who worked with delicate things, who understood that some objects were irreplaceable. Margaret opened the front door. Mother and daughter looked at each other for the first time in 30 years. "You look just like him," Margaret whispered. "Just like your father." Sophie's expression was guarded, uncertain. "I don't know what to call you. I don't know what to feel. My whole life I believed my birth mother was dead, and now you're standing in front of me and I don't know what's real anymore." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it." "Don't apologize for things that weren't your fault." Sophie's voice cracked slightly. "I read the court documents. I know what they did to you. I need to understand. I need to see the evidence for myself. Come inside. I'll show you everything." For the next 3 hours, Margaret walked Sophie through the story of her life. She showed her Daniel's letters, his tapes, the evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed their family. She showed her photographs from before the commitment, Margaret young, and pregnant Daniel smiling with his hand on her belly, the house on Maple Street before 30 years of neglect had turned it into a ruin. She told Sophie about the 4 minutes they had spent together, about the promise Margaret had made to find her no matter how long it took, about the 30 years of waiting and planning and refusing to forget. And she told her about the art collection, the fortune that had nearly destroyed them all, the restitution that Daniel had wanted to make. When Margaret finished, Sophie was crying. "I always knew something was wrong," Sophie said. "The story my parents told me never made sense. A birth mother who died in childbirth with no family, no history, no records. I asked questions, but they always deflected. They said it was painful to talk about, that I should focus on the family I had rather than the one I'd lost. They may not have known the truth. The adoption agency was corrupt. Victoria controlled everything. I want to meet her." Sophie's voice hardened. "Victoria, I want to look her in the eyes and ask her how she could do this, how she could steal a baby from a woman she'd helped in prison." "You'll get your chance. The court hearing is in 2 days. Victoria has been subpoenaed to testify." Sophie wiped her eyes and looked at Margaret with an expression that was painfully familiar. The same determination that Daniel had shown when he decided to do the right thing regardless of the cost. "I'm not going anywhere," Sophie said. "I'm staying until this is finished. I'm staying until Victoria and Thomas face justice for what they did to you, to us, to Dad." Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. "I've waited 30 years to hear you say that." At 8:30 p.m. the phone rang again. This time it was Thomas. His voice was nothing like Margaret remembered. Gone was the smooth confidence, the practiced charm that had fooled her so completely 30 years ago. This voice was desperate, ragged, barely controlled. "Maggie, I need to talk to you." "We have nothing to talk about, Thomas. Please, just listen. I know what you think of me. I know what I did was unforgivable, but you need to understand I didn't want any of this. It was Victoria. She planned everything. Daniel's accident, your commitment, the baby, I just went along with it because I was scared of her." "You're lying." "I'm not. I swear to God, Maggie, I'm not. Victoria has been running everything from the beginning. She knew about Dad's collection before Daniel did. She married me because she thought I would be easy to control, and she was right." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, Daniel's accident?" "The truck driver, the one who hit Daniel's car. Victoria paid him. She arranged the whole thing. I didn't know until afterward. I didn't know she was capable of something like that." "You're telling me your wife murdered my husband and you did nothing. What was I supposed to do? Go to the police? Victoria had evidence of things I'd done, financial crimes, fraud. She said if I ever betrayed her, she'd make sure I went to prison for the rest of my life." Thomas's voice cracked. "I've been trapped for 30 years, Maggie, just like you. Don't you dare compare yourself to me. You stole my life. You stole my daughter. You helped kill Daniel. I know, and I'm sorry, but I can help you now. I can testify against Victoria. I can give you everything you need to put her away forever." Margaret was silent for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm dying." Thomas's voice dropped. "Pancreatic cancer? Stage 4? The doctors give me 6 months at best. Victoria doesn't know yet. When she finds out, she'll try to have me killed too, the same way she killed Daniel. So I'm going to destroy her first." "How do I know this isn't another trap?" "You don't. But ask yourself this, what do I have to gain by lying? I'm going to die, whether you trust me or not." The only question is whether I die as a coward who let his brother's wife destroy his family, or whether I die as someone who finally did one decent thing. Margaret looked across the room at Rachel, who had been listening to the conversation on speakerphone. Rachel nodded slowly. "Where are you, Thomas?" "Florida. I can be in Connecticut by tomorrow morning." "Then come. Bring everything you have on Victoria. And Thomas." "Yes." "If this is a trap, I will make sure you spend your last 6 months in a prison cell." Thomas laughed bitterly. "After everything I've done, I probably deserve exactly that." Thomas Sullivan arrived at Dorothy's house at 7:42 a.m. the next morning. Margaret barely recognized him. The man who stepped out of the rental car was a ghost of the brother-in-law she remembered. 30 years had not been kind to him. His face was gaunt-yellowed with the jaundice of liver failure. His hands trembled constantly. His once thick hair had thinned to wisps of gray, clinging to a spotted scalp, but it was his eyes that shocked her most. They held something she had never seen in Thomas before. Shame. "Maggie?" His voice cracked on her name. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that not a single day has passed in 30 years when I haven't thought about what I did to you." "Save it for the courtroom." Margaret's voice was ice. "I didn't invite you here for absolution. I invited you here because you have information I need." Thomas nodded, accepting her rejection like a man who had long ago stopped expecting anything better. "Where do you want me to start?" "Start with Daniel. Tell me exactly how Victoria killed my husband." They sat at Dorothy's kitchen table. Rachel had her recorder running. Elena was taking notes. Sophie stood in the corner, her arms crossed, watching the uncle she had never known confess to crimes that had shaped her entire life. Thomas spoke for 2 hours without stopping. He told them about Victoria's obsession with the Sullivan art collection, how she had spent years researching its existence, piecing together rumors and fragments until she was certain it was real, how she had married Thomas specifically because he was Daniel's brother, the weak link in the family, the one she could manipulate. "Victoria never loved me," Thomas said. "I knew that from the beginning, but I was stupid enough to think it didn't matter. I thought if I gave her what she wanted, she would eventually see my value." "What did she want?" "The paintings, always the paintings. She had contacts in the black market art world collectors who would pay tens of millions for pieces with no questions asked. All she needed was access." "But Daniel wouldn't give her access." "Daniel was the problem. He was too decent, too honest. When he started talking about returning the collection to the original owners, Victoria panicked. She had already promised certain pieces to certain buyers. There were deposits involved, people who don't take kindly to broken promises." Rachel leaned forward. "What kind of people?" "The kind who make problems disappear. Victoria had been dealing with them for years, using her gallery connections to move questionable artwork. When Daniel threatened to expose the collection, she went to them for help." Margaret felt her stomach turn. "The truck driver who hit Daniel's car." "His name was Marcus Webb, a professional. Victoria paid him $200,000. He was supposed to make it look like an accident, and he did. The police never questioned it." "Where is Marcus Webb now?" "Dead, killed in a bar fight 6 months after Daniel's accident." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Victoria doesn't leave loose ends." Sophie stepped forward, her face pale with fury. You knew my father was murdered, and you did nothing." "I didn't know until afterward. Victoria told me the night of Daniel's funeral. She said it was done and there was no going back, and if I ever breathed a word to anyone, I would be next." "You're a coward." "Yes." Thomas met Sophie's eyes without flinching. "I'm a coward. I've always been a coward. But I'm trying to do one brave thing before I die. Will you let me—" Sophie turned away, unable to look at him any longer. At 10:15 a.m., Thomas produced the evidence he had brought from Florida: 3 boxes filled with documents, recordings, and photographs, financial records showing payments from Victoria to Dr. Kessler, communications between Victoria and the adoption agency, contracts with black market art dealers, and most damning of all, a series of emails between Victoria and Marcus Webb dated 1 week before Daniel's death discussing the Sullivan problem and how to resolve it permanently. Rachel went through the boxes with growing amazement. This is enough to put her away for life. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, racketeering. Why did you keep all of this insurance? Thomas's voice was hollow. I knew Victoria would turn on me eventually. I thought if I had enough evidence I could protect myself. Instead, I just spent 30 years too afraid to use it. You could have freed Margaret at any time. You could have stopped all of this. I know, and I'll have to live with that for whatever time I have left. Thomas looked at Margaret. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to make things right before I die. Let me testify. Let me tell a jury exactly what Victoria did. Let me destroy her the way she destroyed everyone else." Margaret studied the dying man in front of her. 30 years ago, she would have wanted him to suffer. She would have wanted him to experience every moment of pain she had endured in that psychiatric prison. But 30 years had taught her something about revenge. It was empty. It solved nothing. Justice was different. Justice meant making sure Victoria could never hurt anyone again. "You'll testify. Everything, every crime, every payment, every conversation. I'll name names and produce documents and answer every question the prosecution asks. Even if it means you spend your last months in prison, I'd rather die in a cell knowing I finally did the right thing than die free knowing I never had the courage to try." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we have a deal." At 2:30 p.m., Rachel Park held a press conference outside the Hartford courthouse. The media had been following Margaret's story for days now. Reporters from every major network were present, their cameras trained on the steps where Rachel stood with Margaret, Sophie, and Thomas arranged behind her. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to announce that my client, Margaret Sullivan, has been the victim of one of the most elaborate criminal conspiracies in Connecticut history. Over the next several days, we will present evidence proving that Margaret was falsely committed to Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital in 1994 as part of a scheme to steal her husband's estate. We will prove that her husband, Daniel Sullivan, was murdered to prevent him from exposing this scheme. And we will prove that Victoria Sullivan Hayes, currently one of the most prominent art dealers in Manhattan, masterminded every aspect of this conspiracy." The reporters erupted with questions. "What evidence do you have? Will there be criminal charges? Is it true that a fortune in stolen artwork is involved?" Rachel raised her hand for silence. "I can't comment on the specific evidence at this time, but I can tell you that Thomas Sullivan, Victoria's estranged husband, has agreed to testify against her. Thomas will provide documentation proving Victoria's involvement in Daniel Sullivan's murder, Margaret's fraudulent commitment, and the illegal adoption of Margaret's daughter, Sophie." More shouting, more questions, more chaos. And somewhere watching on a television screen, Victoria Sullivan Hayes was learning that her carefully constructed empire was about to collapse. At 5:47 p.m., Victoria's lawyers filed an emergency motion to dismiss all charges against their client. The motion claimed that Thomas Sullivan was a known criminal whose testimony could not be trusted. It claimed that Margaret Sullivan was a psychiatric patient whose statements were the product of delusion. It claimed that the entire case was a coordinated attack by people with financial motives to destroy a successful businesswoman. Judge Harold Washington denied the motion within an hour. "The evidence presented by the plaintiff is sufficient to warrant a full hearing," he wrote. "The defendant's attempts to discredit witnesses before they have even testified suggests a consciousness of guilt that the court finds troubling." The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. the following morning. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in Dorothy's living room looking at photographs of Daniel that she had recovered from the house. Young Daniel at their wedding. Middle-aged Daniel holding her on their 20th anniversary. Daniel 3 weeks before his death, smiling at the camera, unaware that his own family was planning to kill him. Sophie found her there at 2:30 a.m. "You should rest. Tomorrow is going to be difficult." "I've spent 30 years resting, waiting, being patient." Margaret traced Daniel's face with her finger. "I keep thinking about what he would say if he could see all this. If he knew that his own brother helped kill him, that his daughter grew up without knowing who she was." Sophie sat down beside her mother. "Tell me about him. Not the facts, not the history. Tell me what he was like." Margaret closed her eyes, and for a moment Daniel was alive again in her memory. "He was the kindest man I ever knew. When we first met, I was working as a waitress at a gallery opening. I didn't belong there. Everyone could see it. But Daniel looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. He asked me questions about the art, actually listened to my answers, treated me like my opinions mattered. Love at first sight? No, I was suspicious of him at first. Men like Daniel didn't pursue women like me without ulterior motives. But he kept coming back. Week after week, showing up at the restaurant where I worked, ordering coffee and talking to me for hours. It took me 6 months to believe he was genuine. And when you did, I fell completely. The way you fall when you stop protecting yourself, when you let someone see all the broken pieces and trust them not to use those pieces against you." Margaret opened her eyes. "Your father never betrayed that trust, not once in 15 years. He was good, Sophie, truly good. And they killed him for it." Sophie reached out and took her mother's hand. "We're going to make them pay for what they did. All of them. I know, but Sophie, Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. I want you to understand something. Tomorrow you're going to see a side of this world that's ugly and cruel. You're going to hear things about your family that will make you sick. And when it's over, you'll have to decide what kind of person you want to be, bitter and consumed by revenge like I was for 30 years, or something better. What do you want me to be? Margaret smiled sadly. I want you to be what your father would have wanted. Someone who fights for justice without losing themselves in the fight. Someone who can look at all this ugliness and still believe that goodness is possible. Is that what you believe? I'm trying to. After everything, I'm still trying. The hearing began at 9:03 a.m. in Courtroom 4 of the Hartford Superior Court. Judge Washington presided from the bench, his expression grave. The gallery was packed with reporters, spectators, and representatives from law enforcement agencies who had suddenly become very interested in Victoria Sullivan Hayes' business dealings. Victoria sat at the defense table flanked by 3 attorneys in expensive suits. She was dressed conservatively, her silver hair pulled back, her expression carefully composed. But Margaret could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. Victoria was afraid. Good. Rachel called Margaret to the stand first. Mrs. Sullivan, please tell the court about the morning of January 27, 1994. Margaret spoke clearly, steadily, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. She described the visit from Thomas and Victoria, the appointment with Dr. Kessler, the evaluation that had twisted her words into symptoms. She described the orderlies who had dragged her from the office, the commitment papers she had never been allowed to read, the 30 years of imprisonment that had followed. During your time at Pinecrest, did you ever receive a proper hearing regarding your commitment? No, I requested hearings dozens of times. I wrote letters to courts, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen. None of my requests were ever processed. None of my letters were ever sent. And your daughter, what happened to her? Margaret's voice faltered for the first time. I held her for 4 minutes after she was born. Then they took her away. Victoria had already arranged the adoption. I wasn't even allowed to say goodbye. The courtroom was silent. Several people in the gallery were crying. No further questions. Victoria's lead attorney, a sleek man named Harrison Grant, rose for cross-examination. Mrs. Sullivan, you claim you were falsely committed. But isn't it true that you exhibited signs of mental instability following your husband's death? I was grieving. That's not the same thing. You claim Dr. Kessler falsified his evaluation, but isn't it possible that you were simply too ill to recognize your own symptoms? Dr. Kessler wrote a letter admitting that he was paid to falsify his findings. That letter has been entered into evidence. Grant's expression flickered. Letters can be forged. The letter was found in my brother-in-law's possession. Thomas Sullivan is prepared to testify to its authenticity. Thomas Sullivan is a dying man with a grudge against his wife. His testimony is hardly reliable. Then explain the bank records showing $50,000 transferred from Thomas's account to Dr. Kessler 3 weeks before my commitment. Explain the communications between Victoria and the adoption agency. Explain why in 30 years no one ever gave me the psychiatric hearing I was legally entitled to. Grant had no answer. He returned to his seat. If you've been following Margaret's fight for justice from the beginning, the next witness will show you just how deep Victoria's corruption went. Stay with me. Thomas Sullivan took the stand at 11:17 a.m. He walked slowly, his body ravaged by the cancer that was killing him, but his voice was steady as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Rachel approached him with a folder of documents. Mr. Sullivan, can you describe your relationship with Victoria Sullivan Hayes? We were married in 1979, divorced in 2018. For most of those years, I was her partner in crimes I'm deeply ashamed of. What crimes specifically? Fraud, conspiracy, accessory to murder. Thomas's voice cracked. The murder of my own brother. The courtroom erupted. Judge Washington banged his gavel for order. Please explain, Mr. Sullivan. Thomas told the story from the beginning. Victoria's obsession with the Sullivan art collection, her frustration when Daniel refused to sell the paintings on the black market, her decision that Daniel had become a problem that needed solving. She hired a man named Marcus Webb, a professional killer. She paid him $200,000 to arrange an accident. I didn't know about it until after Daniel was dead. Did you report this to the police? No, Victoria told me that if I ever said anything, she would make sure I went to prison for the financial crimes she had involved me in, and she showed me photographs of Marcus Webb, before and after photographs. Webb himself was killed 6 months later. Victoria arranged that too. What about Margaret Sullivan's commitment? Victoria planned everything. She knew that with Daniel dead, Margaret was the only obstacle to accessing the art collection. She convinced Dr. Kessler to falsify the psychiatric evaluation. She convinced me to play the concerned brother-in-law. She even arranged for Margaret's baby to be adopted by a family she controlled so she could use Sophie as leverage if Margaret ever became a problem. Mr. Sullivan, why are you testifying against your former wife now? Thomas looked directly at Victoria for the first time since taking the stand. Because I'm dying. Because I've spent 30 years living with the guilt of what I helped her do. Because my brother deserved better. Because Margaret deserved better. And because I want to die knowing that I finally stopped being a coward. Victoria's face remained impassive, but Margaret could see her knuckles whitening where she gripped the edge of the defense table. Grant rose for cross-examination. Mr. Sullivan, you've admitted to participating in fraud and conspiracy. Why should the court believe anything you say? Because I have documentation. Bank records, communications, contracts. Everything I'm telling you can be verified. You claim your wife arranged your brother's murder. Do you have any direct evidence of that? Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small device. I have this, a recording I made in 2003 when Victoria was drunk, and I was tired of pretending I didn't know what she'd done. The courtroom went silent. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this recording into evidence. Grant leaped to his feet. Objection. This recording was made without Mrs. Sullivan Hayes' consent. It's inadmissible. Connecticut is a one-party consent state, Rachel countered. As long as one party to the conversation consented to the recording, it's legally admissible. Judge Washington nodded. I'll allow it. Play the recording? The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Victoria's voice filled the room, slurred with alcohol, but unmistakable. You want to know what happened to Daniel Fine? I'll tell you, I arranged it. I paid Marcus $200,000 to run that truck into his precious car. And you know what? I'd do it again. Daniel was going to ruin everything. He was going to give away a fortune because he had some stupid moral objection to keeping what his father stole. So I stopped him. Thomas's voice on the recording. What about Margaret? What about the baby? Margaret is exactly where she belongs, and the baby is insurance. If Margaret ever gets out, if she ever becomes a problem, I have her daughter. I can make Sophie disappear just like I made Daniel disappear. The recording ended. Victoria Sullivan Hayes sat frozen at the defense table. Her carefully composed expression had shattered completely. She looked like a woman watching her entire world collapse around her. Grant tried to recover. This recording could be fabricated. Voices can be synthesized. We have forensic authentication, Rachel interrupted. The recording has been analyzed by 3 independent experts. It's genuine. Judge Washington's voice was ice. Mrs. Sullivan Hayes, you will remain in custody pending criminal charges. Bailiff. Victoria rose slowly. For a moment, her eyes met Margaret's across the courtroom. You think you've won? Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. You haven't won anything. The paintings are worthless without proper documentation. The families will sue you for possession. You'll spend the rest of your life in court. Maybe, Margaret replied, but I'll spend it free, and you won't. The bailiff led Victoria away in handcuffs. At 4:23 p.m., Dr. Raymond Kessler was arrested at his retirement community. 2 FBI agents knocked on his door while he was watching television. They presented him with a warrant for his arrest on charges of fraud conspiracy and accepting bribes in connection with the wrongful commitment of psychiatric patients. Kessler tried to run. He made it 3 steps before his 83-year-old legs gave out and he collapsed on his front lawn. The agents helped him up and put him in the back of their car. By evening, news of Victoria's arrest had spread worldwide. The story had everything. Murder, stolen Nazi art, a woman imprisoned for 30 years, a fortune worth $300 million, a mother separated from her daughter. Media trucks lined the street outside Dorothy's house. Reporters shouted questions whenever anyone appeared at the door. Interview requests flooded in from every major network. But Margaret wasn't interested in interviews. She was sitting in Dorothy's kitchen with Sophie looking at the photographs Daniel had left behind. What happens now? Sophie asked. Now we start the process of returning the paintings to their rightful owners. Daniel had documentation on most of the pieces. He'd traced their provenance back to the families they were stolen from during the war. Some of those families have been searching for these works for 70 years. And the paintings that can't be traced, they'll be sold and the proceeds will go to a foundation, the Daniel Sullivan Foundation for Art Restitution, It will help families recover looted artwork and provide legal assistance to people who have been wrongfully imprisoned. Sophie was quiet for a moment. "You're not keeping any of it." Margaret shook her head. "I don't want the money. I never did. I just wanted my life back, my daughter back, the chance to finish what Daniel started." She looked at Sophie. "The house on Maple Street is still mine. It needs a lot of work, but it's home. I'd like to restore it. Live there again. Maybe someday, if you wanted, you could visit." Sophie reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I don't want to visit. I want to help you restore it. I'm an art restoration specialist. I've spent my whole life learning how to repair things that have been damaged by time and neglect." She smiled through tears. "Let me help you repair our family." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "I've been waiting 30 years to hear you say that." At 8:30 p.m., Rachel Park arrived with news. The FBI has opened a formal investigation into Victoria's art dealing business. They found evidence of dozens of transactions involving questionable provenance. She's been selling looted artwork for decades. How many pieces? At least 40 that they can document. Collectors all over the world are going to be demanding refunds or facing investigations themselves. Victoria's entire empire is collapsing. And Thomas? He's been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. The cancer means he won't face prison time, but his cooperation will be noted if he survives long enough for any civil suits. Rachel hesitated. "He wants to see you, Margaret. He knows you don't owe him anything, but he asked if you would consider visiting him before he dies." Margaret thought about the man who had helped destroy her life, the coward who had stood by while his wife murdered his brother and imprisoned his sister-in-law, the weakling who had spent 30 years too afraid to do the right thing. "I'll think about it," she said finally, "but not today. Today I want to spend with my daughter." Rachel nodded and left. Sophie looked at her mother. "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" "I don't know. Maybe, maybe not." Margaret sighed. "Your father believed in second chances. He believed that people could change, could become better than their worst moments. I've never been as good at believing that as he was." "But you're trying?" "I'm trying." The night grew late, but neither Margaret nor Sophie wanted to sleep. They sat together in Dorothy's living room, talking about everything and nothing. Sophie told Margaret about her life in Boston, about the artwork she had restored, about the adoptive parents who had raised her with love, even if they had hidden the truth of her origins. Margaret told Sophie about Daniel, about their courtship and marriage, and the 15 years they had spent building a life together. And somewhere between the stories, they began to feel like family. At 11:47 p.m., exactly 1 week after Margaret had escaped from Pinecrest, Dorothy came into the living room with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. "I think this calls for a celebration," she said. "Margaret is free, Victoria is in jail, Sophie is home, and I, for one, am grateful to have had a front-row seat to justice finally being served." They raised their glasses. "To Daniel," Margaret said, "who saw the right thing and tried to do it even when it cost him everything." "To Daniel," Sophie echoed. "To family," Dorothy added, "the kind you're born into and the kind you choose. May we all be wise enough to know the difference." They drank. Outside, the media trucks were finally leaving. The story was winding down, at least for tonight. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But for now, in this moment, Margaret Sullivan was surrounded by people who loved her. Her daughter beside her, her friend across the room, the memory of her husband warm in her heart. For the first time in 30 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The morning after Victoria's arrest, Margaret woke to a sound she hadn't heard in 30 years. Silence. Not the institutional silence of Pinecrest filled with distant footsteps and muffled cries and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. This was different. This was the silence of a house where she was safe, where no one would come to give her pills she didn't need, where no one would write observations in a chart that defined her existence. She lay still for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. She was free. Victoria was in jail. Sophie was sleeping in the room next door, and today they would begin the work of rebuilding everything that had been destroyed. At 7:15 a.m., Rachel Park arrived with coffee and news. The FBI moved fast overnight. They've frozen all of Victoria's assets pending investigation. Her gallery has been shut down. Her accounts have been seized. Rachel set a folder on the table. "They found something else, Margaret. Something you need to see." "What is it?" "Documentation." Victoria kept meticulous records of every piece of stolen art she'd sold over the past 30 years. Names of buyers, prices paid, original provenance. She was basically running a criminal enterprise out of a Manhattan gallery, and she wrote it all down. Margaret opened the folder. Page after page of transactions. Paintings that had been looted from Jewish families during the Holocaust sold to collectors who either didn't know or didn't care about their origins. Sculptures taken from museums in occupied territories. Artifacts that belonged in history books, not private collections. How much? In total, the FBI estimates Victoria moved over $200 million in questionable artwork over 3 decades. Some of those pieces are in museums now. Some are in private collections. Some have been resold multiple times. Rachel shook her head. This is going to take years to untangle. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her hair still tousled from sleep. What's going to take years? Justice, Margaret said quietly. But we have time now, all the time in the world. At 9:30 a.m., Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She called Eleanor Ashford at the Cliffside Inn and asked her to begin the process of moving the Sullivan collection to a secure facility. Then she called a number Rachel had given her, a man named David Rothstein, who specialized in Nazi-looted art restitution. Rothstein arrived in Connecticut that afternoon. He was in his 60s with white hair and kind eyes that held the weight of decades spent trying to right historical wrongs. Mrs. Sullivan, I've been doing this work for 40 years. I've helped hundreds of families recover artwork that was stolen from their grandparents, their great-grandparents. Most of the time, the pieces are gone forever. Destroyed, hidden, lost to history. He paused. What your husband assembled is one of the most significant collections of recoverable looted art I've ever seen. If we handle this correctly, we can return these works to families who have been searching for them for generations. That's what Daniel wanted. That's what I want. Then let's begin. The process started immediately. Rothstein's team began documenting each painting, comparing them to databases of stolen artwork, reaching out to organizations that tracked Nazi-looted art. Within days, they had made their first match. A Klimt portrait of a young woman, stolen from a family named Blumenthal in Vienna in 1938. The family had been sent to concentration camps. Only one descendant had survived, a woman named Sarah Blumenthal, who was now 87 years old and living in Tel Aviv. Margaret made the call herself. Mrs. Blumenthal, my name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm calling from Connecticut. I have something that belongs to your family. The old woman's voice trembled. What do you mean? A painting, a portrait of a young woman. It was taken from your family's home in 1938. My husband recovered it many years ago, and he wanted to return it to you. I'm calling to tell you that it's coming home. Silence on the line. Then very quietly, the sound of an elderly woman crying. That painting is of my mother. I was 3 years old when they took it. I've been looking for it my entire life. You don't have to look anymore. If you've been following Margaret's journey from the beginning, you know that this moment is what Daniel died trying to make possible. Stay with me as more families discover what has been hidden for 70 years. Over the following weeks, more matches were made. A Monet water lily painting traced to a French collector who had died at Auschwitz. His grandson, now a professor in Paris, flew to Connecticut to see it with his own eyes. A Renoir portrait matched to a family in Amsterdam, whose great-grandmother had been one of the most prominent art collectors in pre-war Holland. They had photographs of the painting hanging in her salon. They had searched for it for 3 generations. A Picasso sketch connected to a Spanish family that had fled to South America during the war, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of the artwork they had left behind. Each recovery was a story. Each return was a restoration of something that had been stolen twice, first by the Nazis, then by time and greed and indifference. Margaret attended every handover ceremony. She watched as elderly survivors held paintings they had last seen as children. She watched as grandchildren touched canvases their grandparents had described in stories they had half believed. She watched as history was slowly, painfully, triumphantly reclaimed. You're giving away a fortune, Sophie said one evening, watching Margaret sign another transfer document. These paintings are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They're not mine to keep. They never were. Dad could have sold them. He could have kept quiet and lived like a king. Your father wasn't that kind of man. Neither am I. Margaret looked at her daughter. Some things are more important than money, Sophie. Some debts can only be paid with justice. At 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Victoria's arrest, Thomas Sullivan died. Margaret received the call from the hospice in Florida. She had never visited him after all. She had never found the words to say to the man who had helped destroy her life, no matter how much he had tried to make amends at the end. But when the call came, she felt something she hadn't expected. Grief. Not for the Thomas who had betrayed her, but for the Thomas who might have been. The boy Daniel had grown up with. The brother who had once been trusted. The man who had spent 30 years being too afraid to do the right thing and who had finally found his courage only when death forced his hand. "Do you want to go to the funeral?" Sophie asked. "No, but I think we should do something else." "What?" "Thomas left a will. Everything he had, he left to the Daniel Sullivan Foundation. It's not much, maybe a few $100,000 after debts, but he wanted it to go toward helping people who had been wrongfully imprisoned." "That's more than he deserved." "Maybe. But it's what Daniel would have wanted. To give people second chances even when they don't deserve them." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. "You're a better person than I am." "No, I'm just tired of carrying hate. It's heavy, Sophie. After 30 years, it's so heavy." The trial of Victoria Sullivan Hayes began 3 months after her arrest. The prosecution had assembled an overwhelming case. Thomas's testimony recorded before his death. Dr. Kessler's confession obtained in exchange for a reduced sentence. Gerald Foster's documentation of systematic fraud at Pinecrest. The recordings Daniel had made proving Victoria's involvement in his murder. And the FBI's evidence of 3 decades of art trafficking, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Victoria's defense team tried every tactic. They claimed the recordings were fabricated. They argued that Thomas was lying to protect himself. They suggested that Margaret was mentally unstable and her testimony couldn't be trusted. None of it worked. On the 4th day of the trial, Margaret took the stand. She spoke for 6 hours. She described everything that had been done to her, from the fraudulent commitment to the theft of her daughter to the 30 years of imprisonment. She spoke about Daniel, about their marriage, about the life they had built together. She spoke about the 4 minutes she had spent holding Sophie before Victoria took her away. And she spoke about survival, about the pills she had hidden under her tongue, about the schedules she had memorized, the weaknesses she had cataloged, the escape she had planned for decades, about the determination that had kept her sane when everything around her was designed to convince her she was crazy. When she finished, half the jury was crying. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Margaret sat in the courtroom holding Sophie's hand. Rachel was beside them, her face tense with anticipation. Dorothy, who had insisted on attending every day of the trial, sat in the gallery behind them. The foreperson stood. "On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." Victoria's face went white. "On the count of fraud in connection with psychiatric commitment, guilty. On the count of kidnapping, guilty. On the count of racketeering and criminal enterprise, guilty. On the count of trafficking and stolen property, guilty." "Guilty on all counts." Victoria collapsed back in her chair. Her attorneys tried to comfort her, but she pushed them away. Judge Washington set sentencing for the following month. Victoria Sullivan Hayes was remanded to custody pending that hearing denied bail due to flight risk. As the bailiffs led her from the courtroom, Victoria turned to look at Margaret one last time. "You think this changes anything? You think getting me convicted gives you back what you lost?" Margaret met her eyes without flinching. "No, nothing can give me back the 30 years you stole, but this makes sure you can never steal from anyone else. And that's enough." Victoria had no response. The bailiffs led her away, and she disappeared, through a door that would lead eventually to a prison cell where she would spend the rest of her life. Justice Margaret thought was not revenge, but it was close enough. The sentencing hearing was brief and brutal. Judge Washington, who had presided over the entire case, did not hide his contempt for Victoria Sullivan Hayes. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a defendant so thoroughly committed to evil. You murdered your own brother-in-law for money. You imprisoned an innocent woman for 30 years. You stole a child from her mother. You built an empire on stolen art and human suffering." His voice hardened. "And you showed no remorse, not once, throughout this entire proceeding." Victoria stood motionless, her face a mask. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will die in a cell, Mrs. Sullivan Hayes, just as you condemned Margaret Sullivan to do." Victoria was led away. She did not look back. In the gallery, Margaret felt Sophie squeeze her hand. "It's over," Sophie whispered. "It's finally over." "No," Margaret said quietly. "It's just beginning." What comes next is the part of the story that matters most. Stay with me as Margaret builds the life that was stolen from her and discovers that justice is only the first step toward healing. The restoration of the house on Maple Street took 8 months. Margaret oversaw every detail, working with contractors who had heard her story and offered their services at reduced rates. The roof was replaced. The foundation was repaired. The walls were stripped down and rebuilt with the same care that Daniel had lavished on them 40 years ago. Sophie took a leave of absence from her job in Boston and moved to Connecticut to help. She used her skills as an art restoration specialist to repair what could be saved to preserve the original details that Daniel had installed with his own hands. The built-in bookshelves were restored, their hidden compartment maintained as a reminder of the secrets the house had kept. The kitchen was modernized, but retained its original layout, the same space where Margaret had cooked thousands of meals for a family that had never deserved her love. The master bedroom was transformed into something bright and peaceful, a room where Margaret could finally sleep without dreaming of escape. "It's beautiful," Sophie said on the day the restoration was completed. "Dad would have loved it." "Your father did love it. He spent years making this house perfect. Everything I've done is just restoring what he built." "Not everything." Sophie gestured around her. "This feeling, this warmth. That's you, Mom. That's what you brought back." Margaret looked at her daughter, this woman she had held for 4 minutes 30 years ago, who had become a stranger and then miraculously become family again. "I never stopped believing I would find you. Every day in that hospital, every night when the despair was worst, I held on to the thought of you, my daughter, out there somewhere, waiting for me to come home." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I felt it. I know that sounds crazy, but I always felt like something was missing. Like there was a piece of me that had been taken away. I used to dream about a woman with green eyes who held me and whispered that she would find me. I did whisper that. In those 4 minutes, I promised you I would come back. And you did." Mother and daughter held each other in the house that had survived everything. The Daniel Sullivan Foundation officially launched 6 months after Victoria's conviction. Margaret stood at a podium in the Hartford Convention Center facing an audience of journalists, art historians, legal experts, and families whose artwork had been recovered through the foundation's work. Sophie stood beside her. Rachel Park and Elena Martinez were in the front row. Dorothy Henderson, despite her protests that she was too old for such events, sat in a place of honor near the stage. 30 years ago, my husband Daniel Sullivan was murdered trying to do the right thing. He had inherited a collection of artwork that his father had brought back from Europe after World War II. Most of those pieces had been stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Daniel wanted to return them. He died for that belief. Margaret's voice was steady, clear. "I spent 30 years locked away for the crime of being in the way. My daughter was stolen from me. My home was destroyed. Everything I loved was taken." She paused. "But I survived. And now I have the chance to finish what Daniel started." She gestured to a screen behind her, which displayed photographs of the artwork that had been recovered and returned. In the past 6 months, the Daniel Sullivan Foundation has returned 47 pieces of looted art to the families they were stolen from. We have established legal aid programs for people who have been wrongfully committed to psychiatric institutions. We have created scholarships for descendants of Holocaust victims to study art history and preservation. This is Daniel's legacy, not the paintings themselves, but the belief that wrongs can be righted, that stolen things can be returned, that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. She looked out at the audience. "I am 69 years old. I spent 30 years as a prisoner. I lost my husband, my home, my daughter, everything that made me who I was. But I never lost hope, and I never stopped believing that someday, somehow, I would find my way back to the light. This foundation is my promise that the light is real, that no matter how dark things get, no matter how long the night lasts, morning will eventually come." The audience rose to their feet applauding, and for the first time in 30 years, Margaret Sullivan smiled without reservation. The first anniversary of Margaret's escape fell on a Friday in October. Sophie had organized a small gathering at the restored house on Maple Street. Dorothy was there along with Elena and Rachel. David Rothstein came with his wife. Eleanor Ashford made the drive from Newport. Even some of the families whose artwork had been returned sent representatives wanting to thank the woman who had made restitution possible. Margaret walked through the rooms of her home, touching the walls that Daniel had built, sitting in the chairs they had shared, looking at photographs that had survived 3 decades of searching and neglect. On the mantel above the fireplace, she had placed 2 photographs. One was their wedding picture restored from the water-damaged original found in Daniel's lockbox. Margaret in white. Daniel in his best suit, both of them young and hopeful and completely unaware of what the future held. The other was a new photograph taken just weeks ago. Margaret and Sophie standing together on the front porch, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. Mother and daughter reunited after 30 years. "You look happy," Sophie said, appearing beside her. "I am happy. For the first time since before your father died, I am truly, completely happy." "No regrets?" Margaret considered the question. "I regret the years I lost. I regret that I never got to watch you grow up, never got to see your first steps or hear your first words or hold you when you cried. I regret that your father never got to know you, never got to see what an incredible woman you've become." She turned to face her daughter. "But I don't regret the fight. I don't regret surviving. I don't regret any of the choices I made to get here, to this moment in this house with you." "Mom?" Sophie's voice cracked. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph. An ultrasound image, grainy and indistinct, showing a tiny figure curled in darkness. "I'm pregnant, 14 weeks. I was going to wait until later to tell you, but I couldn't. I wanted you to know that what you fought for, what you survived for, it wasn't just about getting your life back. It was about this, about family, about the future." Margaret took the photograph with trembling hands. A grandchild. After everything, after all the loss and grief and rage, she was going to have a grandchild. "Have you chosen a name?" Sophie smiled through tears. "If it's a boy, we're naming him Daniel, after Dad. And if it's a girl, Margaret, after the strongest woman I've ever known." That night, after the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet, Margaret sat alone on the front porch. The October air was cool, hinting at the winter to come. The stars were visible through gaps in the clouds, distant and unchanging, the same stars she had looked at through the barred window of Pinecrest for 30 years. But everything else had changed. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the betrayal and the imprisonment, the pills hidden under her tongue and the schedules memorized in darkness, the escape through rain and mud, the bus driver who had shown her kindness, the neighbor who had given her shelter when she had nothing. She thought about the evidence Daniel had hidden, waiting for her to find it, about the fortune that had been used for justice instead of greed, about the families whose stolen artwork had finally come home. She thought about Sophie sleeping upstairs in the room that had once been a nursery, carrying a child who would never have to wonder where they came from or who their family was. And she thought about Daniel. "I finished it," she said quietly, speaking to the stars, to the memory, to whatever remained of the man she had loved. "Just like you asked, I found the collection. I returned the paintings. I destroyed the people who destroyed us." A breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard. "And I found our daughter Daniel. She's amazing. She's strong and brave and kind, just like you. She's going to be a mother herself soon. You would have been so proud." Margaret wiped tears from her face. "I miss you. Every day I miss you. But I'm not alone anymore, and I'm not afraid anymore, and I'm not angry anymore." She took a deep breath. "I'm just grateful. Grateful for the 15 years we had together. Grateful for the evidence you hid. Grateful for Sophie. Grateful for every person who helped me when I had no one." She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. "I'm going to live now, Daniel. Really live, not just survive. I'm going to watch our granddaughter grow up. I'm going to run the foundation, in and help people who have been through what I've been through. I'm going to wake up every morning in our house and go to sleep every night in our bed and remember that every moment of freedom is a gift." She looked up at the stars one last time. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for hiding the truth where only I could find it. Thank you for loving me enough to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. I love you. I've loved you since I was 23 years old, and you walked into that gallery and saw something in me that nobody else could see. I'll love you until I die, and when I do, I'll find you again. I promise." The breeze died down. The stars continued their ancient dance. And Margaret Sullivan, 69 years old survivor, grandmother-to-be, walked back into her home. 3 years later, Margaret Sullivan attended her granddaughter's first birthday party. The house on Maple Street was filled with laughter and chaos and the kind of ordinary joy that Margaret had once thought she would never experience again. Sophie and her husband had moved to Connecticut to be close to Margaret. Dorothy Henderson, now 87, but showing no signs of slowing down, had become an honorary great-grandmother. Elena Martinez and Rachel Park came by regularly, family in all the ways that mattered, and little Margaret, named for the grandmother who had fought for 30 years to build this moment, toddled across the living room floor with frosting on her face and determination in her eyes. "She's going to be a fighter," Sophie said, watching her daughter with love and exhaustion. "She already refuses to take no for an answer. She comes by it honestly." Margaret picked up her granddaughter and held her close, feeling the small heart beating against her chest. This was what she had survived for. Not revenge, not justice, not the fortune in paintings or the foundation that bore Daniel's name. This, a child in her arms, a family around her, a future that stretched forward instead of backward. "I spent 30 years dreaming about this moment," Margaret whispered to the little girl who bore her name. Every night in that hospital, every day when I wanted to give up, I imagined holding you. I imagined being here, being free, being loved. Little Margaret gurgled and grabbed at her grandmother's necklace. You're going to grow up knowing exactly who you are and where you come from. You're going to know about your great-grandfather Daniel, who died trying to do the right thing. You're going to know about your grandmother Margaret, who survived 30 years of hell because she refused to forget who she was. Sophie appeared beside them. What are you telling her? The truth, the story of our family. The whole story, the dark parts too. Margaret looked at her daughter, at her granddaughter, at the house that Daniel had built and she had reclaimed. All of it, the betrayal and the survival, the loss and the recovery, the years of darkness and the moment when the light finally broke through. She smiled. Because that's what this family is about, Sophie. We don't hide from our history. We learn from it. We let it make us stronger. And the moral of the story, Margaret kissed her granddaughter's forehead and set her down to continue her explorations. The moral is simple. No matter what they take from you, no matter how long they keep you locked away, no matter how hard they try to make you forget who you are, you have to hold on. You have to keep fighting. You have to believe that somewhere on the other side of the darkness there's a life waiting for you.
She asked.
She watched little Margaret toddle toward a pile of birthday presents, already curious about what treasures lay inside. And if you're lucky, if you never give up, if you survive long enough, you'll find that life is better than anything you could have imagined. Margaret Sullivan lived for another 12 years. She saw her granddaughter start school, learn to read, develop a passion for art that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her blood. She saw Sophie become a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, specializing in the recovery and restitution of looted artwork. She saw the Daniel Sullivan Foundation grow into one of the most important organizations in the art world, returning hundreds of pieces to the families they had been stolen from. She saw Dorothy Henderson pass away peacefully at 93, surrounded by the family she had chosen to love. She saw Elena Martinez become a journalist specializing in institutional abuse, winning a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into psychiatric facilities that still operated the way Pinecrest had. She saw Rachel Park appointed to the federal bench where she spent years fighting for the rights of people who had no one else to fight for them. And every morning she woke up in the house on Maple Street and thanked God for another day of freedom. Margaret Sullivan died on a Tuesday in October, exactly 42 years after her escape from Pinecrest. She was 80 years old. Her heart simply stopped quietly and without warning while she was sitting on the front porch watching her great-grandchildren play in the yard. Sophie found her there peaceful and still, with a smile on her face. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, families whose artwork had been returned, victims of wrongful imprisonment who had been helped by the foundation, journalists, lawyers, art historians, and ordinary people who had been moved by her story. Little Margaret, now 15 years old, gave the eulogy. My grandmother spent 30 years in a prison she didn't deserve. She lost her husband. She lost her child. She lost everything that mattered to her. But she never lost hope. She never forgot who she was. And she never stopped fighting to come home. The teenager's voice was strong, clear, carrying across the cemetery where Daniel Sullivan had been buried 43 years before. When I was little, she used to tell me that the most important thing in life wasn't how much money you had or how famous you were or how powerful you became. The most important thing was knowing who you were and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. Little Margaret looked at the casket that held her grandmother's body. She knew who she was. She was Margaret Sullivan, wife of Daniel, mother of Sophie, grandmother of Margaret, survivor, fighter, champion of justice. And she was loved by her family, by the people she helped, by everyone whose life she touched. Rest in peace, Grandma. You earned it. The casket was lowered into the ground beside Daniel's grave. Mother and daughter, husband and wife reunited at last, and on the headstone beneath Margaret's name and the dates of her birth and death were carved the words she had asked Sophie to write. She never forgot who she was. Because that is the truth of Margaret Sullivan's story. Not the fortune in paintings, or the corrupt doctor, or the evil sister-in-law who had tried to steal everything. Not the 30 years of imprisonment, or the dramatic escape, or the courtroom victory that had put Victoria behind bars. The truth is simpler than that. The truth is that a woman was locked away for 30 years, and she refused to disappear. She held on to herself, her memories, her identity with a grip that nothing could break. She survived through patience and determination and an unshakable belief that someday, somehow, she would find her way back to the life that had been stolen from her. And she did. She found her daughter. She reclaimed her home. She finished the work her husband had started. She built a legacy that would outlast her by generations. She proved that the human spirit, when it refuses to surrender, is stronger than any prison. She proved that justice, even when it comes 30 years late, is still justice. And she proved that love, real love, the kind that survives loss and betrayal and decades of separation, never dies. So if you're listening to this story, wherever you are, whatever you're going through, remember Margaret Sullivan. Remember that she was 68 years old, when she escaped when most people would have given up hope decades before. Remember that she had nothing but $127 and a promise when she walked out of that psychiatric hospital into the rain. Remember that she built everything from nothing, with the help of strangers who became family and the memory of a husband who had believed in her until the very end. And remember what she would tell you if she were here. You know who you are. No one can take that from you. Hold on. Keep fighting. The light is real, and no matter how dark the night gets, morning will always come.